Beneath the soil we walk on every day, civilizations rise, collapse, and vanish, leaving behind only questions. Objects that shouldn't exist, structures that defy explanation, symbols no living person can translate. Archaeology isn't just about the past. It's about everything we still don't know, the gaps in human history that swallow whole centuries whole. Tonight we're going somewhere strange, somewhere unsettling, somewhere genuinely, beautifully mysterious. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's uncover the discoveries that keep archaeologists awake at night. Deep in the eastern foothills of the Ecuadorian Andes, where the jungle swallows every road and the air itself feels ancient, there exists a place that has quietly unsettled explorers, archaeologists, and dreamers for decades. The Cueva de los Tallos, the Cave of the Oilbirds. To reach it, you descend. Literally. The main entrance requires a rope and a willingness to drop nearly 30 meters straight into the earth, into a darkness so complete it feels less like absence of light, and more like the presence of something else entirely. The cave system stretches for kilometers beneath the Ecuadorian rainforest, its chambers vast and cathedral-like, its walls draped in moisture, its silence broken only by the eerie clicking calls of the Tallos birds that nest there. The cave's ancient, living residents. The Shuar people, indigenous to this region, have known this cave for centuries. To them, it is not merely a geological feature. It is sacred, a threshold, a place where the earth breathes and memory runs deeper than bone. And then, in 1973, a Hungarian-Argentine author named János Juan Moric made a claim that would send shockwaves through the world of alternative archaeology. He said he had found something inside. Moric claimed to have discovered, deep within the Tallos cave system, an enormous underground library. A vast collection of metallic books, engraved with an unknown script, alongside zoomorphic figurines and objects made from materials that seemed to him entirely out of place in the ancient Amazonian world. He called it the Metal Library. He described plates of gold and other alloys, bound and stacked with an almost architectural precision, as though someone, or something, had deliberately archived the knowledge of a lost civilization. His account found its most famous amplifier in Erich von Däniken, the Swiss author who wove the Metal Library into his broader theories about extraterrestrial influence on early human civilization. Suddenly, the Tallos caves were everywhere. Theories multiplied. The library became, in certain circles, evidence of Atlantis, of pre-flood civilizations, of contact with beings from beyond our world. Most mainstream archaeologists were, and remain, deeply skeptical. But here is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to dismiss entirely. In 1976, a major joint expedition was organized between the Ecuadorian military and a Scottish team that included, remarkably, Neil Armstrong, the first human being to walk on the moon. Armstrong, a man not easily given to fantasy, agreed to co-lead the expedition. Over 100 people participated. They mapped sections of the cave, documented its geology, cataloged its known contents. They found no metal library. But they also, and this is the detail that tends to linger, did not fully explore the entire system. The Tallos caves are not a single chamber. They are a labyrinth. Kilometers of unmapped passages, sections that remain to this day unexamined. What were they looking for exactly? And how certain can we be of what they didn't find? There are archaeologists who believe the Tallos caves do hold genuine pre-Columbian artifacts of cultural and historical significance. Not alien manuscripts, not golden libraries, but real, tangible evidence of ancient Shuar and possibly older ceremonial life. Objects that have never been formally cataloged, spaces that have never been properly illuminated. And there are others, quieter, more careful in their language, who simply say that the cave system is larger than any single expedition has been able to fully account for. What strikes you, sitting with all of this, is not the extraordinary claims. It's the ordinary, stubborn fact that remains at the center of everything. Nobody has proven the library doesn't exist, and in the deep, dripping silence of the Teos caves, that absence of proof feels, somehow, like a presence of its own. Before moving to the next mystery. If you love deep dives into mysteries like this, I put together an entire ebook dedicated to the hidden secrets of ancient Egypt. The Egypt they don't cover in school, don't show in museums, and don't explain in mainstream documentaries. The link is right below this video. Now, let's get into the next mystery. And yet, the Teos Caves are not the only place in Ecuador where something strange was waiting to be found. Not far away, in the quiet city of Cuenca, a different kind of mystery had been accumulating for decades. Not underground, but inside the walls of a church. Carlos Crespi Croce was an Italian Salesian missionary who arrived in Ecuador in the 1920s. By all accounts, he was a remarkable man, a priest, a filmmaker, a botanist, an anthropologist, and above all, a deeply beloved figure among the indigenous Shuar and Canary communities he served for over 50 years. He built schools. He documented local culture. He earned a trust that very few outsiders ever had, and the people who trusted him brought him gifts. Over the course of several decades, the indigenous communities of the Ecuadorian highlands and jungle began presenting Crespi with objects, artifacts, pieces they had found, inherited or retrieved from places they rarely discussed in detail. Crespi accepted everything. He cataloged what he could and stored the rest in the courtyard and interior of the Church of Maria Auxiliadora in Cuenca, where he lived and worked. By the time the outside world began paying serious attention, he had accumulated what some described as one of the most extraordinary private collections of ancient artifacts ever assembled in South America. What made it extraordinary was not its size. It was what the objects appeared to show. Among the collection were metal plates, some appearing to be gold, others silver or copper alloy, engraved with figures, symbols, and scenes that seemed, to many who examined them, entirely inconsistent with any known pre-Columbian culture in the region. There were depictions that some researchers compared to ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Others pointed to symbols resembling Sumerian or Phoenician script. There were human figures rendered in styles that felt Mediterranean, even Middle Eastern, in their posture and proportion. There were what appeared to be representations of pyramids, of animals not native to South America, of celestial maps. And then there were the stranger pieces, objects whose material composition and craftsmanship seemed, to certain observers, technically improbable for the cultures and time periods they were supposedly associated with. Crespi himself was careful in what he claimed. He did not, on the record, make sweeping declarations about lost civilizations or ancient contact. But he did believe the collection was significant. He believed it pointed to a history that had not yet been properly written. In 1960, a fire tore through the church storage area, destroying an unknown portion of the collection. What was lost has never been fully determined. What survived was eventually, after Crespi's death in 1982, largely absorbed by the Central Bank of Ecuador, though accounts differ on exactly how much was preserved, how much was discarded as fake, and how much simply disappeared. That word, fake, sits at the center of everything when it comes to the Crespi collection. The mainstream archaeological position is relatively straightforward. Many, perhaps most, of the objects in the collection were not ancient at all. They were crafted by local artisans and given to Crespi as gestures of affection and respect, a beloved priest receiving handmade tributes from communities who knew he treasured such things. The unusual symbols and imagery in this reading were simply creative interpretations or deliberate imitations of designs the artisans had seen in books or heard described by outsiders. The collection, in this view, is a fascinating anthropological document, but of the 20th century, not of antiquity. It is a reasonable argument, and it may well be correct, but it does not fully account for everything. Several researchers who physically examined portions of the collection before and after the fire noted objects whose patination and material degradation were consistent with genuine age. Not decades, but centuries. Metallurgical analysis conducted on a small number of pieces suggested compositions and techniques that were not typical of regional craft traditions. And the sheer volume and consistency of certain iconographic patterns across multiple objects, patterns that Crespi himself reportedly could not explain, gave some serious scholars pause. There is also the question of provenance. The indigenous communities who brought these objects to Crespi were not presenting him with things they had made. They were presenting him with things they had found, or things that had been passed down through generations with instructions to keep them hidden. Where had those objects come from originally? That question was rarely asked with enough persistence, and the people who might have answered it are, for the most part, no longer living. Erich von Däniken, whose name surfaces wherever these South American mysteries gather, visited Crespi in the 1970s and photographed portions of the collection. He made bold claims about what the objects proved. Those claims were widely dismissed. But the photographs themselves remain, and they show things that are, at minimum, genuinely difficult to categorize. What is perhaps most striking about the Crespi collection is not any single object within it. It is the pattern, the accumulation. The fact that across decades, across dozens of separate donations from unconnected individuals, a consistent thread of anomalous imagery kept appearing, symbols and forms that seem to point somewhere else, somewhere older, somewhere that does not appear on any accepted map of ancient South American civilization. Was it coincidence, cultural creativity, deliberate fabrication, or something that the conventional history of this continent has not yet found a comfortable place for? Carlos Crespi died at the age of 90, surrounded by the people he had served his entire life. Whatever he truly believed about the objects in his care, he took most of it with him. The collection, now scattered, partially destroyed, and only partially preserved, remains one of the most contested bodies of artifacts in South American archaeological history. And somewhere in the highlands of Ecuador, in communities that still remember the old priest with great warmth, there may be people who know exactly where those objects came from. Whether they will ever say so is another question entirely. There is something about South America that keeps pulling us deeper. From the caves of Ecuador to the highlands of Peru, this continent holds its secrets with a particular kind of patience, as though the land itself is in no hurry to be understood. And in the southern reaches of Peru, not far from the vast, cold expanse of Lake Titicaca, there is a structure carved into a natural rock face that has been quietly defying easy explanation for a very long time. The locals call it Puerta de Huayhuamarca, the door of the spirits. Researchers and visitors from outside the region tend to call it the Aramu Muru doorway. Whatever name you use, the first sight of it is genuinely arresting. Rising from a sheer face of reddish-pink andesite rock, the structure presents itself as a large, perfectly symmetrical T-shaped recess, approximately 7 meters tall and 7 meters wide, carved with a precision and intention that is impossible to mistake for natural erosion. At its base, centered and shallow, sits a smaller niche, just large enough for a single person to stand inside. The overall shape is unmistakable. It looks, with striking clarity, like a door. A door that leads nowhere. A door with no hinges, no threshold, no opening of any kind. Just solid rock, carved to look like an entrance into something that isn't there. The surrounding landscape deepens the strangeness. The Altiplano of southern Peru is a high, windswept plateau, sparse and austere, the kind of place where silence has texture. There are no major ruins immediately nearby, no obvious ceremonial complex, no settlement whose presence would neatly explain why someone chose this particular rock face in this particular location to carve something so deliberate and so large. The Aymara people of the region have lived alongside this structure for generations, and their oral traditions offer the oldest available framework for understanding it. In their accounts, Huayhuamarca is a sacred threshold, not a metaphorical one, but a literal gateway between the physical world and a realm of gods and ancestors. The door in this tradition is not decorative. It is functional. It has been used, and it can, under the right conditions, be opened. One particular legend describes a priest-king named Aramu Muru, a figure said to have fled the destruction of a great civilization, carrying with him a golden solar disk of immense spiritual power. Pursued and desperate, he arrived at this rock face, performed a ceremony, and passed through the door, disappearing entirely from the physical world, leaving behind only the disk, which was subsequently taken to the temple complex of Tiwanaku across the Bolivian border. Archaeologists and historians approach this account with appropriate caution. Oral traditions, however vivid and internally consistent, are not direct historical records. The legend of Aramu Muru cannot be verified, dated, or cross-referenced with any known written source. The golden disc has never been found. What can be said with more confidence is that the carving itself is genuinely ancient, and that its construction required considerable skill and deliberate effort. The symmetry is precise. The angles are clean. The smaller niche at the base shows signs of significant wear, polishing consistent with prolonged physical contact over a long period of time. Someone or many people across many generations stood in that niche repeatedly, touched it, pressed against it. Why? In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as the site became more widely known outside Peru, a different category of visitor began arriving, and with them, a different category of claim. Numerous individuals, some of them treating the experience with great seriousness, reported unusual sensations while standing in the small niche at the base of the doorway. Visions, a feeling of being pulled or expanded. Sounds without visible sources. Several accounts, gathered independently and from people with no prior connection to each other, described seeing a brief shimmer or luminescence within the rock itself, as though, for a moment, the door was less solid than it appeared. These accounts prove nothing. They cannot be measured or reproduced under controlled conditions, and it would be easy, perhaps too easy, to attribute them entirely to expectation, suggestion, and the powerful atmospheric quality of the location itself. But they persist. Across cultures, across decades, across visitors who arrived as skeptics and left uncertain. There are researchers within the broader field of archaeoacoustics, the study of sound within ancient structures, who have noted that certain carved rock formations in the Andes appear to have been deliberately shaped to produce specific acoustic effects. Whether the Aramu Muru doorway was designed with any such intention has not been formally studied, but the question has been asked. Others have pointed to the geographical relationship between the doorway and Lake Titicaca, which sits less than 35 kilometers away. Titicaca is itself one of the most mythologically significant bodies of water in the ancient Andean world, the supposed origin point of the sun, of the first people, of civilization itself, according to both Incan and pre-Incan cosmology. Whether the doorway was positioned in deliberate relationship to the lake or to specific astronomical alignments visible from that location remains largely uninvestigated. There are so many questions here that have simply never been properly asked. What is most enduring about the Aramu Muru doorway is perhaps the simplest thing about it, the thing you notice before any theory, before any legend, before any claimed experience. Someone made this. Someone stood in this remote, wind-swept place and chose this rock face and carved, with great care and considerable effort, the shape of a door. They wanted it to look like an entrance. The question that the stone itself seems to ask in its patient, silent way is whether that was purely symbolic, or whether whoever built it genuinely believed, or perhaps knew, that it could be something more. We have been looking in so many of these places at doors, doorways carved into rock, caves that descend into darkness, collections that gesture toward civilizations we cannot name. Each mystery seems to ask the same quiet question from a different angle. How far back does the human story really go? How much have we lost? How much are we still, without quite realizing it, standing just outside of? Sometimes the answer, or the deepest version of the question, arrives not as a monument, not as a cave system, but as a small, flat piece of wood, barely larger than your hand, Lake Orestiada sits in the Kastoria regional unit of northern Greece, surrounded by mountains and the particular stillness of a landscape that has been continuously inhabited for a very long time. The water is calm and relatively shallow, and beneath its surface, preserved by the cold, oxygen-poor sediment that accumulated over millennia, the remains of an ancient lakeside settlement had been waiting, largely undisturbed, for thousands of years. In 1993, during a systematic archaeological excavation led by Professor Georgios Hormouziadis of the University of Thessaloniki, a wooden tablet was brought up from the lakebed. It was small, fragile with age, and covered in a series of carefully incised marks, lines, symbols, and notations arranged with a deliberateness that was immediately apparent to everyone who examined it. The tablet was carbon dated. The results placed it at approximately 5260 BC, making it at the time of its discovery one of the oldest known examples of written or proto-written symbols ever found anywhere in the world. Let that settle for a moment. 5260 BC. That is more than 7,000 years ago. It predates the Sumerian cuneiform writing of Mesopotamia, long considered the cradle of written language, by well over 1,000 years. It predates the earliest Egyptian hieroglyphics by a similar margin. If the marks on the Dispilio Tablet constitute a genuine writing system, or even a structured proto-writing system, then the history of human written communication would need to be pushed back considerably further than most textbooks currently place it. The academic world responded with careful, measured interest, which is precisely the appropriate response to a finding of this magnitude. The mainstream position, held by most linguists and archaeologists, is that the marks on the tablet likely represent a proto-writing system rather than a fully developed language. In this reading, the symbols were used for record-keeping, ritual notation, or as a form of symbolic communication, meaningful within their community, but not a structured language in the way we would recognize today. This would place the Dispilio Tablet in a category alongside other Neolithic marking systems found across Europe and the Near East. Significant, yes, but not necessarily evidence of a sophisticated literate civilization operating thousands of years before Sumer. It is a reasonable and defensible position, but it is not the only position. A smaller group of researchers, working primarily within the contested framework of what has been called the Old European Script hypothesis, argue that the marks on the Dispilio Tablet, along with similar symbols found on artifacts from the Vinca culture and other Neolithic Balkan sites, represent something more structured than simple notation. They point to the recurrence of specific symbols across geographically separated sites, across centuries of cultural continuity, as evidence of a shared and systematic symbolic language. A writing system, in other words, that predates Sumer not by decades but by millennia. This hypothesis remains outside the mainstream. It has been argued over, tested, and largely set aside by the broader academic community, which points to the lack of any demonstrated syntactic structure in the surviving marks as evidence against true writing. Without syntax, without the ability to demonstrate that the symbols encode grammar, sequence, and meaning in a reproducible way, the threshold for calling something a writing system is not met. And yet, the marks on the Dispilio Tablet have never been fully deciphered. They have been catalogued, photographed, and studied, but the question of what they actually say, if they say anything, remains genuinely open. We cannot read them, and our inability to read them is not, by itself, evidence that they contain nothing to read. There is a deeper problem too, one that sits quietly beneath the scholarly debate. Shortly after the Dispilio Tablet was exposed to air following its excavation, it began to deteriorate. The preservation conditions that had protected it for over 7,000 years were gone, and the wood began to dry, crack, and degrade. Efforts were made to stabilize it, but some of the surface detail was lost in the process. We may never have a perfect, complete record of every mark the original carver placed on its surface. What was on the portions we can no longer clearly read? Were there symbols that might have shifted the interpretation? Were there patterns that a fuller record might have made legible? We cannot know. What remains is a fragment. Of wood, of symbol, of a mind that lived and thought and recorded something 7,000 years ago on the edge of a Greek mountain lake. A person who looked at a piece of wood and decided that marks upon it could carry meaning beyond the moment of their making. Who believed, in other words, in the possibility of communication across time. They were right about that much, at least. We are still receiving their message. We simply have not yet worked out what it says. And until we do, if we ever do, the Dispilio Tablet will continue to sit at the edge of what we think we know about the origins of human language, asking its quiet, persistent question. What if writing is older than we ever imagined? There is something quietly profound about the idea that language, true, structured, intentional language, may be far older than we have allowed ourselves to believe. And if that is true of written symbols scratched into wood on the edge of a Greek lake, then perhaps it is also true of other forms of human expression. Other ways of leaving a mark. Other ways of saying, across thousands of years of silence, we were here. We lived. We moved through the world, and we wanted you to know it. Because sometimes the message is not written in symbols at all. Sometimes it is painted on a wall. The Libyan desert is one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. A vast, featureless expanse of sand and stone that stretches across northeastern Africa with a kind of absolute indifference to human survival. Temperatures swing from burning to freezing. Water is almost nowhere. The silence is not peaceful. It is total, geological, the silence of a place that has forgotten what life sounds like. And yet, buried within this emptiness, in the southwestern corner of Egypt near the Sudanese border, there's a sandstone massif called the Gilf Kabir, the Great Barrier. It rises abruptly from the desert floor like something the landscape forgot to erode, a plateau of ancient rock riddled with wadis, gullies, and caves formed long before the desert was a desert at all. In 1933, a Hungarian explorer named Laszlo Almasi was moving through this region, mapping, documenting, searching, when he descended into one of these caves and found something that stopped him completely. The walls were covered in paintings. Human figures, rendered in ochre and dark pigment, depicted in fluid, unmistakable motion. They appeared to be swimming. Arms extended, bodies horizontal, legs kicking, the universal posture of a person moving through water. Some figures floated alone. Others moved in groups. The style was confident and natural, the work of people who were painting something they saw regularly, something familiar and ordinary to them. Almasi named it the Cave of Swimmers. The name has stayed. The paintings have been dated, through analysis of pigment composition and associated archaeological material, to approximately 10,000 BC. Though some researchers place certain layers of imagery considerably earlier, possibly as far back as the last ice age. The dating is complex, because the cave contains multiple periods of painting accumulated over what may have been thousands of years of intermittent human return. What makes the Cave of Swimmers so disorienting, so genuinely difficult to absorb, is the landscape surrounding it. There is no water. There has been no water here, in any meaningful sense, for thousands of years. The Sahara, which today is the largest hot desert in the world, was not always what it is now. Between approximately 11,000 BC and 5,000 BC, a period geologists call the African Humid Period, or the Green Sahara, the climate of North Africa was radically different. Monsoon patterns shifted, rain fell, rivers flowed, lakes formed across what is now barren sand. The Gilf Kabir region was, during this period, a living landscape, wet, vegetated, inhabited. The people who painted the Cave of Swimmers were not painting a fantasy. They were painting their world. And then the climate shifted again, slowly and then rapidly, and the water retreated, and the people followed it, and the desert reclaimed everything except the paintings on the stone. The mainstream archaeological interpretation of the Cave of Swimmers is, in broad terms, settled and sensible. The imagery represents the culture and daily life of a population of Neolithic pastoralists who inhabited the region during the Green Sahara period. The swimming figures reflect genuine aquatic activity in a landscape that genuinely supported it. The cave itself may have served ceremonial or spiritual purposes alongside practical ones, a place of gathering, of ritual, of collective memory. This reading is almost certainly correct in its essentials, but the site did not remain purely within the realm of orthodox archaeology. In 1996, Michael Ondaatje's novel, The English Patient, and the subsequent Academy Award-winning film, brought the Cave of Swimmers to global attention, embedding it in a romantic and mysterious cultural context that it has never quite shed. Almasi himself became a figure of legend, real and fictionalized simultaneously. And as the site's public profile grew, so did the more speculative frameworks applied to it. Some researchers working at the edges of accepted archaeological theory have pointed to the Cave of Swimmers as part of a broader pattern of evidence for a sophisticated, continent-spanning culture that flourished across North Africa during the Green Sahara period, a culture whose full complexity has been obscured by the subsequent desertification that buried or destroyed much of what it left behind. In this view, the cave paintings are not isolated folk art. They are remnants of a world that was once far more connected, far more populated, and far more culturally developed than the desert's current emptiness suggests. Others have raised questions about certain figures in the cave that seem, under close examination, less straightforwardly human. Elongated proportions, ambiguous postures, forms that don't quite resolve into the ordinary bodies of swimmers. Whether these are stylistic conventions, ritual representations, or simply the natural variation of human artistic expression, is a question the paintings themselves do not answer clearly. What endures, beyond all the theories and interpretations, is the emotional fact of the thing. Someone stood in this cave, in a green and living version of what is now one of the emptiest places on Earth, and painted people swimming. Painted joy, or ritual, or memory. Painted the specific, irreplaceable texture of their daily life onto stone that would outlast everything else they ever made or said or were. The desert came. The water left. The world they knew disappeared so completely that we can barely imagine it. And still the swimmers move across the wall, suspended in their ancient water, going nowhere, arriving nowhere, endlessly, quietly, in motion. What else did they paint in caves the desert has not yet given back to us? The swimmers on that cave wall were communicating something. We feel it, even across 10,000 years of silence. The certainty that those images were not accidental, not idle. They were chosen, arranged, meant, and that impulse. The need to take something interior and make it visible, permanent, and transmissible seems to be one of the deepest currents running through human history. We saw it in the marks on the Dispilio Tablet. We see it in the paintings of the Gilf Kabir. And we see it again, perhaps most persistently and most mysteriously, in a collection of symbols that kept appearing across an entire civilization, scratched, pressed, and carved into clay across a vast stretch of prehistoric southeastern Europe. They are called the Vinca Symbols, and they have been quietly unsettling the established timeline of human communication for over a century. The Vinca culture flourished across what is now Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and parts of the broader Balkans from approximately 5700 BC to 4500 BC. It was, by any measure, a remarkable civilization, one of the most sophisticated Neolithic cultures in Europe. Vinca settlements were large, planned, and densely populated. Their inhabitants worked copper at a time when metallurgy was supposedly still unknown in the region. They built two-story structures. They traded across considerable distances. They created figurines of extraordinary artistic refinement, the famous Vinca masked figures, with their elongated faces and strange, otherworldly expressions, which have never been fully explained. And on their pottery, their figurines, their spindle whorls, and their ritual objects, they left marks. The same marks, over and over again, across centuries, across hundreds of kilometers of cultural territory. More than 250 distinct symbols have been identified within the Vinca corpus. They appear in consistent combinations, They recur across sites with a regularity that goes far beyond decorative habit. Some symbols appear far more frequently than others, in patterns that suggest hierarchy or grammatical weighting. Certain combinations appear together repeatedly, as though they are fixed phrases or stable units of meaning. When you lay them out and study them, they do not look random. They look structured. The site that gave the culture its name was excavated beginning in 1908 by Serbian archaeologist Miloje Vasic, near the village of Vinca, on the banks of the Danube south of Belgrade. What Vasic uncovered was a tell, a layered mound of accumulated habitation that descended through multiple distinct cultural phases, each yielding more artifacts, more symbols, more evidence of a people who had lived in this place with extraordinary continuity and complexity. The symbols found at Vinca and the dozens of related sites across the region have been dated, in their earliest forms, to approximately 5500 BC. This places them, like the Dispilio Tablet, considerably earlier than the Sumerian and Egyptian writing systems that mainstream history designates as the origins of human literacy. The question that has never been fully resolved is the same question the Dispilio Tablet raised. Are they writing? The scholarly consensus, carefully maintained, is that the Vinca symbols do not constitute writing in the full technical sense, that they lack the demonstrated capacity to encode spoken language and therefore fall into the category of proto-writing or symbolic notation. This is the position of most academic linguists and archaeologists, and it is grounded in a genuine absence of direct evidence for phonetic encoding. But not everyone accepts this boundary so comfortably. The archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, whose work on Old European culture was both celebrated and contested throughout the latter half of the 20th century, argued that the Vinca symbols and related markings from Neolithic Europe represented the remnants of a coherent symbolic and possibly linguistic system belonging to what she called Old Europe, a sophisticated, goddess-centered civilization that preceded and was eventually overwritten by the Indo-European cultures that came to dominate the continent. In her reading, the Vinca symbols were not primitive precursors to writing. They were writing, or something functionally equivalent to it, belonging to a world that has been systematically underestimated. Her theories remain controversial. The specifically religious and cultural framework she built around them has been widely criticized. But the core observation, that these symbols are too consistent, too widespread, and too persistent to be dismissed as mere decoration, has proven difficult to simply set aside. More recently, computational analysis has been applied to the Vinca symbol corpus. Researchers have examined the statistical distribution of symbols, their co-occurrence patterns, and their sequential arrangements using the same methods applied to known ancient writing systems. Some of these analyses have returned results suggesting that the Vinca symbols display the kind of structured, constrained variation that is characteristic of linguistic systems, that they behave, statistically, more like writing than like art. These findings are preliminary. They are contested. They do not by themselves constitute proof of anything, but they have not been disproven either. What strikes you spending time with the Vinca symbols is a particular quality they share with all the other mysteries we have been moving through in this long, quiet exploration. They exist at the exact boundary of what we can confirm and what we cannot. They are too deliberate to ignore and too ambiguous to resolve. They ask a question the evidence cannot yet answer. A woman in a Vinca settlement, 7,000 years ago, pressed a set of marks into the wet clay of a vessel before it was fired. She had done it before. She would do it again. The marks she chose were not random. Her hands knew them, had made them many times, in a specific sequence that meant something specific to the people around her. What did it say? The clay survived. The meaning didn't. Or perhaps it is simply waiting for someone who knows how to listen. There is a pattern forming, if you have been paying attention. Again and again across these mysteries we find the same quiet revelation, that the people who came before us were not simpler than we are, not less curious, not less capable of sustained, organized, sophisticated thought. The Vinca symbols suggest a mind that could create and maintain a structured system of meaning across centuries. The Cave of Swimmers suggests a culture intimate enough with its world to record it with confidence and beauty. The Dispilio Tablet suggests that the impulse to write, to fix thought into permanent form, is older than we have been comfortable admitting. And now we travel further east, to a landscape that suggests something else entirely, that they were also watching the sky. Armenia is one of the oldest continuously inhabited regions on Earth. Nestled between the Caucasus Mountains and the high volcanic plateaus of Western Asia, it sits at a crossroads of ancient worlds, a place where civilizations have risen, collided, and left their marks in stone for as long as human beings have been making marks at all. The landscape is dramatic and severe, mountains that catch clouds, rivers that carve deep gorges, and high open plains where the horizon feels unusually close and the sky unusually large. It is on one of these plains, near the town of Sijian in the Shunik province of southern Armenia, that a site exists which has been generating serious astronomical and archaeological debate for several decades. It is called Karahunj, sometimes written Karahunj. The name is thought to derive from the Armenian words for stone and voice, the speaking stones. The site consists of over 200 basalt-standing stones, arranged across a roughly oval area of several hectares on a basalt ridge overlooking the Dar River Gorge. The stones vary considerably in size. Some are modest, others rise to nearly 3 meters. Many have fallen or shifted over the millennia. But what makes Karahunj immediately and genuinely unusual is not simply the presence of standing stones, which are found across many ancient cultures worldwide. It is the holes. Approximately 80 of the standing stones at Karahunj have circular holes bored through them near their tops. Holes ranging from 4 to 5 centimeters in diameter, angled with apparent deliberateness in specific directions. They are smooth-edged, carefully made, and oriented in ways that, to anyone who studies them with astronomical intent, immediately suggest sighting devices. Tubes of stone pointed at the sky. The site was brought to serious international attention in the 1990s by Armenian astrophysicist Paris Harouni, who conducted an extensive study of the stones and their orientations, and concluded that Karahunj was a sophisticated astronomical observatory, one that had been used to track the movements of the sun, moon, and specific stars with remarkable precision. Harouni dated the site's origins, based on astronomical back calculation of the celestial alignments he identified, to approximately 5,500 BC, with some elements potentially older. If that dating is correct, Karahunj would predate Stonehenge by several thousand years, making it one of the oldest astronomical observatories ever identified anywhere in the world. The mainstream archaeological response has been measured and, in places, genuinely engaged. Excavations conducted at the site have confirmed its antiquity. Material recovered from the area has been dated to the Bronze Age and earlier, with some evidence of Neolithic activity. The site was clearly used for extended periods and holds genuine archaeological significance. Several researchers have acknowledged that the holed stones are unusual and warrant serious investigation. The debate centers on interpretation. How precisely were the alignments calculated? How much of the astronomical correspondence is deliberate design, and how much is the natural result of finding patterns in a large collection of stones oriented across a wide range? The so-called problem of statistical noise in archaeoastronomy. These are legitimate methodological questions, and they have not been fully resolved. But here is what is difficult to explain away. The holes themselves, their consistent diameter, their smooth, worked edges, their placement near the tops of the stones, angled upward. These are not random features. They required effort to produce and intention to position. If they were not sighting devices of some kind, what were they? No alternative explanation has achieved any real traction. The holes remain what they appear to be, carefully made apertures in standing stones, pointed at specific parts of the sky. Some researchers have gone further, drawing connections between Karahunj and the broader megalithic tradition that produced Stonehenge, Karnak, and the standing stone cultures of Western Europe, suggesting that the impulse to build large, astronomically oriented stone structures was not geographically isolated, but reflected a widespread and possibly connected understanding of celestial observation in the ancient world. Whether these cultures were in direct contact or whether they arrived independently at similar solutions to similar questions is itself an open and fascinating problem. Others have noted that Armenia occupies a unique position in the ancient world, a convergent zone between the early cultures of Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and the steppes, and that Karahunj may represent a tradition of astronomical knowledge that fed, directly or indirectly, into the earliest written astronomical records of the Near East. What the stones themselves communicate, standing on that windswept ridge above the river gorge, is something older than any of these theories. They communicate attention, the focused, disciplined, generational attention of people who looked up at the sky night after night, season after season, and found in its movements not chaos, but pattern, not randomness, but law, who built in stone instruments precise enough to track what they saw, who understood in some form that the sky was a clock, a calendar, a map. Through those small, careful holes, someone looked at a star. Which star? What were they measuring? What did they know, standing on that ridge 5 or 6 or 7,000 years ago, that we have not yet thought to ask them? The stones are still there. The holes are still open. We have simply not yet learned how to look through them properly. The stones at Karahunj were pointed at the sky. And perhaps that is the most human thing about them, that impulse to look upward, to find meaning in the movement of distant lights, to build something that could hold that meaning in place across generations. It is an impulse that appears, again and again, in cultures separated by vast distances and centuries of time. As though the sky itself is a question that every sufficiently curious civilization eventually asks. But what happens when the sky is brought down to earth? When the stars, or something like them, are carved not into instruments pointed upward, but directly into stone, at ground level, in a place where a river runs, and the air is warm, and the jungle presses close on every side. That is one of the questions waiting at a site in northeastern Brazil that has resisted confident explanation for as long as anyone has been seriously looking at it. The Pedra do Ingá, the Ingá stone, sits in the municipality of Ingá in the state of Paraíba, Brazil. It is not a small object. The main inscribed surface is a roughly vertical rock face approximately 24 meters long and 3 to 4 meters high, formed from a dark, fine-grained basalt that the local Paraíba River once flowed directly against before its course shifted. The stone is ancient in the geological sense. The rock itself formed hundreds of millions of years ago. But the inscriptions covering its surface are human, deliberate, and deeply strange. Across that long, dark face, carved with evident skill and considerable effort, are hundreds of figures. Geometric shapes, spirals, concentric circles, lines both straight and curved, grids and repeating abstract forms. Human and animal figures rendered with a stylization that feels neither primitive nor naive, and scattered throughout with a frequency and distribution that has attracted particular attention, a series of circular depressions surrounded by radiating lines, forms that many observers, independently and across different decades, have described as looking unmistakably like representations of stars, planets, or celestial bodies. The Ingá stone has been known to European observers since the colonial period, but serious academic study of it accelerated through the 20th century. Dating the inscriptions has proven genuinely difficult. The basalt surface does not lend itself easily to the radiometric techniques applicable to organic materials, and the absence of stratified archaeological context immediately surrounding the stone complicates the picture further. Estimates based on comparative iconography and regional cultural chronology place the inscription somewhere between 6000 BC and 3000 BC, though some researchers have argued for dates outside even this wide range. What is agreed upon, across most serious examinations of the site, is that the inscriptions represent multiple periods of carving, that the stone was returned to, added to, and worked across an extended span of time. It was not a single act of creation. It was an ongoing relationship between a people and a surface. The mainstream archaeological view treats the Ingá stone as a significant but broadly interpretable example of prehistoric rock art. Ritual markings, territorial or cosmological symbols, shamanistic imagery, consistent with what is found in varying forms across many ancient cultures in South America and beyond. This framework is reasonable and well supported by comparative evidence. Rock art of broadly similar character exists throughout the Brazilian interior, and the impulse to carve meaningful symbols into permanent surfaces is, as we have seen repeatedly in this exploration, a deeply human constant. But the Ingá stone has attracted a different order of attention as well. Beginning in the mid-20th century, a series of researchers, some working within academic frameworks, others operating at the margins of accepted scholarship, began arguing that certain elements of the Ingá inscriptions bore specific and non-coincidental resemblances to writing systems from the ancient Old World. Comparisons were drawn to Phoenician script, to ancient Libyan and North African inscriptions, to Sumerian iconography, to the marks of cultures that, according to conventional history, had no contact whatsoever with pre-Columbian South America. The most persistent and detailed of these analyses came from researchers who argued that the Ingá stone recorded astronomical information, specifically a star map. That the circular forms with radiating lines were not merely symbolic evocations of celestial bodies, but precise representations of specific stars and constellations, encoded in a system that, if correctly interpreted, would reveal a sophisticated astronomical knowledge far beyond what is typically attributed to the cultures of prehistoric Brazil. These claims have not been accepted by mainstream archaeology. The comparisons to Old World scripts have been challenged on methodological grounds. The human eye is extraordinarily good at finding pattern and resemblance where none is structurally present, and without a rigorous framework for distinguishing genuine correspondence from coincidental similarity, such comparisons carry limited evidential weight. And yet the astronomical interpretation has not entirely faded. Several independent researchers, approaching the stone with different methodologies across different decades, have arrived at similar conclusions about the celestial character of at least some of the inscriptions. The consistency of that convergence, even among people who did not know each other's work, is not nothing. What no one disputes is the quality of the carving itself. The skill evident in the Ingá inscriptions is not the skill of casual mark-making. The forms are controlled, the depths consistent, the compositions arranged across the full surface with a spatial intelligence that implies planning. Whoever made these marks understood the stone they were working with and had a clear intention for what they were producing. They came back to it, generation after generation, and kept adding to it. That continuity of attention is itself a form of meaning. Something about this stone, in this place, beside this river, mattered to the people who lived here, mattered enough to carve into it across what may have been thousands of years. What did they see when they looked at it? What were they recording, or commemorating, or calling into being with each new mark pressed into that dark basalt surface? The river has shifted. The people are gone. The stone remains, covered in a conversation we have not yet learned to follow. There is a particular kind of mystery that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with dramatic carvings or encoded astronomical charts or symbols that beg to be deciphered. It arrives quietly, in the form of something so visually simple, so immediately comprehensible in its basic shape, that it takes a moment before the strangeness registers. A jar. Just a jar. Except that it is 3 meters tall, carved from solid stone, and it is standing in a field in the mountains of Laos. And there are 2,000 more just like it, scattered across the plateau in groupings that follow no obvious pattern anyone has yet been able to fully explain. The Jingkuang Plateau sits in the mountainous interior of northern Laos, at an elevation that brings cool mist and a quality of light quite unlike the lowland tropics. The landscape is open and rolling, grassy hillsides, scattered trees, a terrain that feels, in certain lights, almost European in its quietness. and distributed across this plateau, across an area of roughly 90 kilometers from north to south, are more than 90 distinct sites containing the stone vessels that give the region its name, the Plain of Jars. The jars themselves are extraordinary objects. They range in height from less than a meter to over 3 meters. They weigh in the larger examples as much as 14 tons. They are carved, each one individually, from a variety of stone types including sandstone, granite, limestone, and conglomerate, some of which does not occur naturally near the sites where the jars now stand, indicating that they were quarried at a distance and transported somehow to their current positions. Most are cylindrical. Some are slightly tapered. A small number have lids, or the remains of lids. Most do not. They have been sitting on this plateau, largely in silence, for somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years. The most widely accepted dating places the majority of the jars in the period between 500 BC and 500 AD, though some researchers argue for earlier origins in certain sites. For much of the 20th century, access to the plateau was severely limited. The Xianghuang region was one of the most heavily bombed areas in the world during the conflicts of the 1960s and 1970s, and the landscape remains contaminated with unexploded ordnance that has slowed archaeological investigation considerably. Large portions of the jar sites have never been formally excavated, not because of lack of interest, but because the ground around them is still, in places, genuinely dangerous. What investigation has been possible has revealed something that shifted the understanding of the jars significantly. For a long time, the dominant theory was relatively straightforward. The jars were funerary vessels used to contain the bodies of the dead during a period of secondary burial, a practice in which remains are first allowed to decompose before the bones are cleaned and deposited in a permanent container. This theory was supported by the discovery of human remains, bones, teeth, cremated fragments, in and around many of the jars, alongside burial goods including ceramics, glass beads, iron implements, and personal ornaments. The funerary interpretation remains the mainstream position, and it is well supported by the physical evidence. The Plain of Jars was, at its core, a burial landscape, a place where the dead were brought, processed, and commemorated by a culture that clearly invested enormous resources of labor and organization in the treatment of its deceased. But the details do not resolve as neatly as the broad outline suggests. The human remains found at the sites are inconsistent in their distribution. Some jars contain remains, many do not. The bones found in and around the jars represent a wide range of ages and physical types, deposited in ways that do not always conform to a simple secondary burial model. Some remains appear to have been cremated. Others show no signs of cremation. Some were found inside the jars. Others were found in pits nearby, or scattered across the surface in ways that suggest disturbance. But disturbance by what, and when, is not always clear. The diversity of burial goods across the sites suggests interaction with multiple distant cultures. The beads found at some sites have been traced to sources in South Asia and possibly further afield, indicating that whoever used this plateau was connected to trade networks of considerable reach. This was not an isolated mountain community. It was part of something larger. But who were they? The culture responsible for the Plain of Jars has no confirmed name, no known written language, no surviving direct descendant tradition that has been definitively linked to the sites. The lowland Lao people, the highland ethnic groups of the region, none carry an oral tradition that straightforwardly claims the jars as ancestral. The people who made them seem, in the cultural record, to have simply ceased, absorbed, displaced, or transformed beyond recognition before anyone thought to write down who they were. There are researchers who have proposed that the plateau served not only as a burial ground, but as a way station, a place where the dead from a wide surrounding region were brought for processing before their remains were redistributed to home communities, the jars functioning as temporary vessels in a complex, geographically extensive mortuary system. This would explain the scale, the distribution, and the variety of the remains and goods found across the sites. It is a compelling model, It may be correct, and yet the jars themselves resist being fully absorbed into any framework. Their scale feels excessive for purely functional purposes. 14 tons of carved stone to hold remains that could have been contained in something far smaller. The effort required to make them, move them, and position them speaks to a belief system, a cosmology, a relationship with death and with the dead that went far beyond mere practicality. Someone believed these vessels mattered, believed perhaps that the stone itself held something, contained something, protected something, that a simpler container could not. What did they think was being kept? And in the jars that have never been opened, in the sites where the ground is still too dangerous to dig, is there still something inside, waiting in the cool mountain air of the Zhenghuang Plateau for someone to finally ask the right question? There is something that connects these mysteries, running beneath all of them like a quiet current. It is the question of scale. The jars on the Zhenghuang Plateau were far larger than they needed to be. The Karahunj stones required a coordination of labor and intention that went beyond what simple functionality would demand. The Vinca Symbols persisted across centuries and hundreds of kilometers, a consistency that implies something more than local habit. Again and again, we find ancient peoples doing things at a scale that exceeds the obvious, the practical, the immediately necessary, as though they were building not just for themselves, but for something larger. Something longer, something that could only be fully perceived from a distance, in time or in space or perhaps both. And nowhere is that impulse more literally, more staggeringly visible than on a high volcanic plateau in western Bolivia, where an ancient civilization covered an area the size of a small country with a network of straight lines, so vast, so precise, and so numerous that they remained essentially unnoticed by the outside world until the age of aerial photography. The Sajama Lines, the Altiplano of western Bolivia, is one of the highest inhabited regions on Earth. At an elevation of roughly 4,000 meters, the air is thin, the light is sharp, and the landscape has a stripped, elemental quality. Volcanic peaks rising above a plateau of scrub grass and dark soil, the sky enormous and close in the way it only is at altitude. It is not an easy place to live. It demands adaptation, endurance, and a particular relationship with the landscape that develops over generations of intimate familiarity. The lines begin, though that word implies an origin point that may not exist, as narrow cleared pathways across the Altiplano surface. They were made by removing the dark volcanic rocks that cover the ground and piling them to the sides, exposing the lighter soil beneath. Each individual line is modest in width, typically between 1 and 3 meters across. Unremarkable if you are standing on one. Easy to miss entirely at ground level. But from above, the picture that emerges is almost incomprehensible in its scope. The Sajama Lines cover an area of approximately 22,000 square kilometers, larger than some countries. Within that area, an estimated 16,000 individual lines have been identified, running in straight trajectories across the plateau, over hills, across rivers, through wetlands, and up the slopes of volcanoes with a geometric precision that does not waver. Many of the lines converge on specific points: churches, shrines, cemeteries, sacred hills, in a radial pattern that suggests deliberate orientation toward meaningful locations. Some run parallel, some intersect, some extend for dozens of kilometers without deviation. The straightness is, in its own way, the most arresting feature. These are not paths that follow the easiest route through the terrain. They go straight regardless of what the terrain does. Up slopes, across gullies, through areas where walking in a straight line would be physically difficult. The people who made them were not following the land. They were imposing a geometry upon it. The lines were made by the Aymara people of the region, and unlike some of the other mysteries in this exploration, there is no ambiguity about cultural authorship. The Aymara are still here. Their communities still surround the Sajama Lines, and their oral traditions and religious practices still maintain a living relationship with the landscape the lines traverse. Radiocarbon dating of organic material associated with the lines suggests construction over an extended period, possibly as long as 3,000 years, with activity continuing into the colonial and even post-colonial era. This continuity is significant. The lines were not a single ancient project, abandoned and forgotten. They were made, maintained, and used across an enormous span of time by a culture that remained continuously present. What were they used for? The research of anthropologist Clive Ruggles and archaeologist John Darling, who conducted the most systematic study of the Sajama Lines in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, points toward a ritual and social function. In their analysis, the lines connected points of religious significance, churches built on or near older sacred sites, ancient burial towers called shulpas, mountain shrines associated with the Apu spirits of Andean cosmology. The lines were, in this interpretation, sacred pathways, routes for ritual procession, for the movement of offerings, for the maintenance of relationships between communities and between the living and the dead. This interpretation is grounded in careful fieldwork and fits well within the broader framework of Andean cosmological geography, in which the landscape is understood as a living, spiritually inhabited space and movement. Through it is itself a form of communication with the sacred. But the scale still asks something that function alone does not entirely answer. 16,000 lines, 22,000 square kilometers, 3,000 years of sustained construction and maintenance. The investment of human labor and collective intention embedded in the Sajama Lines is staggering, comparable in its own way to the great monumental projects of the ancient world, and yet almost entirely unknown outside specialist circles. Why so many? Why so precise? Why continue for 3,000 years? There are researchers who have noted alignments between certain Sajama Lines and astronomical phenomena, solstice and equinox sunrise and sunset directions, the rising and setting points of significant stars. Whether these alignments are deliberate or incidental remains debated. The sheer number of lines means that some will align with celestial events by probability alone, and distinguishing intentional astronomical orientation from statistical coincidence requires a rigor that has not yet been fully applied to the complete dataset. What the Sajama Lines leave you with, ultimately, is a feeling that is difficult to name but impossible to ignore. Someone, many someones, across many generations, decided that this plateau needed to be marked. All of it. Every significant point connected to every other significant point by lines that refused to bend. They were drawing something. A map, perhaps. Or a web. Or a conversation in geometry conducted across 3,000 years between the living and the dead and the mountains and the sky. We are standing inside that conversation. We just don't yet know what it was about. The Sajama Lines were drawn across an entire landscape, a conversation in geometry so vast it could only be fully read from above. A network of intention laid over mountains and plateaus and river crossings, connecting the sacred points of a world that understood itself as wholly, intimately alive. And what is striking, looking back across all the mysteries we have moved through in this long, quiet exploration, is how consistently that impulse appears. The need to mark, the need to connect, the need to impose a pattern of meaning onto the surface of the physical world. Sometimes that pattern covers 22,000 square kilometers, and sometimes it fits on a single flat stone. On the outskirts of Clydebank in the west of Scotland, beneath a residential housing estate built in the mid-20th century, there lies a sandstone slab that most of the people living above it have never seen and may not know exists. It has been buried since 1965, covered deliberately with a protective layer of soil to shield it from the vandalism and weathering that had already begun to damage its surface. The houses were built, life continued, and underneath it all, in the dark and the damp of the Scottish ground, the stone waited. It is called the Cochno stone, and when it was last fully exposed, in 1937, it was described by the archaeologists who studied it as the finest example of Bronze Age cup and ring marks in Europe. The stone itself is a roughly flat sandstone surface approximately 13 meters long and 8 meters wide, large enough to be described as a slab rather than a rock, a platform of stone that sits almost level with the surrounding ground and presents its decorated face to anyone willing to look closely. And what covers that face is extraordinary in its density and variety. Across the entire surface, carved with a precision and consistency that speaks to sustained, purposeful effort, are hundreds of individual marks. The most numerous are the cup marks, simple hemispherical depressions pressed into the stone, ranging from a few centimeters to perhaps 10 centimeters in diameter. There are over 90 of them on the Cochno stone alone. Around many of these cups are rings, concentric circles cut into the surface with a smoothness that implies the use of a compass-like tool, or at least a technique of rotation. Some cups have a single surrounding ring. Others have 2, 3, 4, or more. For many of these cup and ring marks, a single channel or groove extends outward, running across the stone like a tail, sometimes curving, sometimes straight, sometimes connecting to adjacent marks in ways that feel deliberate. There are also more complex forms, spirals, elongated grooves, and configurations that don't resolve neatly into the standard cup and ring typology and have generated their own interpretive debates. The Cochno stone has been dated, on the basis of its stylistic characteristics and regional context, to approximately 3000 to 1500 BC. The Neolithic to Bronze Age transition in Scotland, a period that also produced the stone circles, chambered cairns, and megalithic monuments that survive across the Scottish and Irish landscape. Cup and ring marks are found throughout this region, and indeed across much of northwestern Europe and beyond. In Ireland, in Northumberland, in Brittany, in Galicia, in northwestern Spain, in parts of Scandinavia. The Cochno stone is exceptional in the density and quality of its markings, but it is not isolated. It belongs to a tradition. What that tradition meant, what the marks were for, what they communicated, who made them and why, is one of the most genuinely open questions in British prehistoric archaeology. The range of interpretations offered over the decades is itself telling. Cup and ring marks have been proposed as territorial boundary indicators, as maps of the local landscape seen from above, as astronomical charts recording lunar or solar cycles, as ritual offerings to deities or spirits of the land, as representations of water sources or spring systems, as symbols used in initiation or rites of passage, as abstract art with purely aesthetic intent, and as a writing system or proto-writing whose code has simply not been broken. None of these interpretations has been conclusively proven. None has been conclusively disproven. The astronomical hypothesis has attracted particular sustained attention. Researchers including Archibald Thom, who spent decades studying megalithic sites across Britain, and more recent investigators using modern computational tools, have identified potential alignments between cup and ring mark configurations and celestial events. Solstices, lunar standstills, the rising and setting points of significant stars. Some of the radial grooves extending from cup marks at Cochno and similar sites appear, in certain analyses, to point toward specific astronomical horizons. Others have approached the marks through the framework of rock art semiotics, comparing the Cochno stone's configurations to similar marks found across Europe and further afield, looking for structural patterns that might suggest a shared symbolic vocabulary operating across cultures and distances. The recurrence of the cup and ring form, that specific combination of central depression and surrounding circles, across so many geographically separated sites has led some researchers to suggest either cultural contact over very long distances, or the independent convergence of multiple cultures on a symbol whose form carries some intrinsic or universal meaning. What that meaning might be, rooted in the deepest structure of human perception and cognition, has not been determined. In 2016, archaeologists from the University of Glasgow undertook a careful re-excavation of the Cochno stone, exposing it for a period of several weeks to conduct a comprehensive 3D laser scan, the most complete and precise record of the stone's surface ever produced. The scan revealed details invisible to the naked eye and has provided researchers with a digital record that can be studied without the stone needing to be re-exposed to the elements. New marks were identified that had not appeared in earlier surveys. The full complexity of the surface, it turned out, had not previously been appreciated. The stone was then reburied. It is, beneath that housing estate, still there. There is something quietly extraordinary about that fact. One of the most significant prehistoric carved surfaces in Europe, lying in the dark under the ordinary daily life of a Scottish suburb. Children playing in gardens above it. Cars reversing on driveways. The whole texture of contemporary life proceeding, unaware, over something that was already ancient when the pyramids of Egypt were new. The people who carved the Cochno stone looked at a flat surface and saw a canvas. They pressed their tools into it with care and returned to it over what may have been generations, adding marks to marks, building a composition that covered nearly the entire available surface. They were making something, saying something, recording something that mattered to them profoundly. We have the stone. We have every mark on it, captured now in extraordinary digital detail. We still do not know what it says. The Cochno stone lies in the dark, buried beneath the ordinary weight of contemporary life, holding its carved surface in careful preservation, waiting perhaps for a question precise enough to unlock what it carries. And what strikes you, sitting with that image, is how many of these ancient marked surfaces share a quality of patience. They do not demand to be understood, they simply persist. Through ice ages and migrations and the rise and fall of every civilization that has passed over or around them, they remain exactly what they were made to be. Surfaces covered in human intention, outlasting the humans who made them by thousands of years. But there is a particular category of marked stone that carries an additional weight. A weight that is not metaphorical, but literally physical. The weight of altitude, of remoteness, of the specific deliberate choice to climb to a place where survival is difficult and the air is thin and the wind does not stop, and to carve, up there, in that inhospitable height, images that must have mattered enormously to justify the journey. We have already visited Armenia once in this exploration. The speaking stones of Karahunj, pointed at the sky on a high southern plateau. But Armenia holds more than one ancient secret, and the one we are moving toward now sits considerably higher and considerably further from any comfortable place than the stones at Karahunj. Ughtasar is a volcanic lake nestled in the Gagama mountain range of central Armenia at an elevation of approximately 3,300 meters above sea level. The name translates with a directness that is almost poetic as Camel Mountain, a reference to the distinctive humped profile of the volcanic cone when seen from a distance. In summer, the high meadows around the lake carry wildflowers and the occasional herd of sheep, and the silence is the particular silence of altitude, clean, total, and strangely loud in its completeness. In winter, the site is buried under snow and entirely inaccessible. For perhaps 8 months of every year, no human being can reach it. And yet, across the dark volcanic basalt surfaces surrounding the lake, spread across an area of several square kilometers, there are more than 2,000 petroglyphs. They were carved, pecked, more precisely, using harder stone tools to chip away at the basalt surface, across an enormous span of time. The earliest images at Ughtasar have been dated to approximately 12,000 BC, placing them among the oldest known rock art in the South Caucasus region, and possibly among the oldest in the broader Near Eastern world. The most recent additions appear to date from the Bronze Age, around 2000 to 1000 BC, meaning the site was visited and added to across a period of roughly 10,000 years. 10,000 years of return. 10,000 years of climbing to this difficult, beautiful, inhospitable place and pressing images into stone. The images themselves are remarkable in their variety and their vividness. There are animals, an extraordinary abundance of animals. Aurochs, the massive wild cattle that once roamed across much of Eurasia, depicted with a muscularity and confidence that suggests intimate familiarity. Deer, bears, wolves, wild boar, ibex, and dogs. Hunting scenes of real narrative complexity. Groups of animals being pursued by human figures armed with bows, the composition arranged with a spatial intelligence that reads almost like sequential illustration. There are scenes that appear to show corralling or herding, suggesting that some of the images date from the transition between hunter-gatherer and pastoral lifeways. A transition that, in this region, occurred over thousands of years and left its record here, on these rocks, in real time. There are human figures too, dancers, it seems, in some panels, arranged in lines or circles with a rhythmic repetition that implies ceremony. Figures that carry weapons or tools. Figures whose postures suggest ritual rather than practical action. And scattered throughout, with a frequency that has attracted consistent attention from researchers. Abstract forms, circles, spirals, grids, and geometric configurations whose relationship to the figurative imagery around them has not been convincingly explained. The mainstream archaeological interpretation of Ughtasar frames it as a high-altitude ritual and hunting site, a place where communities came seasonally to conduct ceremonies connected to the hunt, to mark transitions of season or life cycle, and to maintain a living connection with a landscape that was central to their subsistence and their cosmology. This reading is well supported by the content and distribution of the images and fits naturally within the broader pattern of how similar high-altitude sites have been understood across the ancient world. But the site raises questions that this framework, reasonable as it is, does not fully resolve. The altitude itself is the most persistent of these questions. At 3,300 meters, Ughtasar is not a place you pass through. It is not on the way to anywhere. Reaching it in any period before modern infrastructure required a significant and deliberate journey, especially in the earlier Neolithic and Mesolithic periods when the earliest images were made, when the climate of the region was different and the logistics of high-altitude travel would have been formidable. People did not come here by accident or convenience. They came because the place itself demanded it. Because something about this specific location, this volcanic lake, at this specific height, with its specific relationship to the surrounding peaks and the sky above them, was considered worth the effort. What made it worth it? Some researchers have pointed to the astronomical positioning of Ughtasar, its elevation and its relationship to the horizon as seen from the valley communities below, its potential as a site from which celestial events were observed or marked. Others have noted that volcanic landscapes across many ancient cultures were associated with the intersection of the earthly and the divine, places where the interior of the earth had, literally, broken through to the surface, and where the boundary between worlds was considered thin. There is also a more recent layer to the Ughtasar story. The site remains relatively unstudied by international standards. Access is limited, documentation is incomplete, and the full catalog of petroglyphs has never been comprehensively published. There are images at Ughtasar that have been seen by only a handful of researchers, panels that have been noted but not yet analyzed, sections of the basalt field that have been observed but not systematically recorded. In the age of satellite imaging and digital archaeology, it remains possible, genuinely, practically possible, that significant images at Ughtasar have not yet been properly examined by anyone with the tools to understand them. A figure carved 12,000 years ago into dark basalt beside a mountain lake, unseen in any meaningful sense for all of that time. Waiting, with the same patience as all the others, for the right eyes to finally find it. What stories are still up there, in the thin air above 3,000 meters, that no one has yet thought to ask about? The images at Ughtasar were made by people who climbed, who looked at a volcanic lake surrounded by thin air and difficult terrain and decided, across 10,000 years of return, that this was a place worth reaching. There is something in that commitment, that sustained, generational willingness to make the journey, that speaks to a relationship with landscape that most of us, in the modern world, have largely lost. The idea that a place could be sacred not despite its difficulty, but because of it. That the effort required to reach somewhere was itself part of what the place meant. We find that same quality in the next stone we are moving toward. Not at altitude this time, but in a different kind of threshold landscape. A creekside clearing in the folded mountain valleys of the southern Appalachians, where a large, flat soapstone boulder has been sitting in a field in western North Carolina for longer than anyone has been able to determine. and carved across its surface, in a density and variety that continues to resist every systematic attempt at interpretation, are the marks that the Cherokee people have known about and told stories about for as long as their oral tradition reaches back. This is the Judaculla rock. The setting, in Jackson County, North Carolina, is gentle rather than dramatic. The surrounding landscape is the soft green of the southern Appalachians, rounded ridgelines, hardwood forest, the sound of Caney Fork Creek running nearby. The boulder itself is a large, gently sloping outcrop of soapstone, sometimes called steatite, a dark, fine-grained metamorphic rock with a smooth surface that accepts carving with relative ease compared to harder stone types. It measures roughly 18 meters at its longest, though not all of this surface is carved, and it sits at a slight angle, its upper face presented to the sky in a way that would have made it an inviting surface for anyone with the intention to mark it. The carvings cover a substantial portion of that surface in a density that, on first encounter, feels almost overwhelming. There are several thousand individual marks at Judaculla Rock. Estimates vary, and the full count depends on how individual elements are defined and separated. What is certain is that the surface is extraordinarily complex. There are zoomorphic figures, animal forms, some identifiable, others ambiguous. There are anthropomorphic figures, human-like shapes, including one large figure with what appear to be 7 fingers on one hand, which has attracted particular attention in both academic and traditional interpretive contexts. There are geometric forms, circles, grids, parallel lines, cross-hatching. There are elongated, sinuous marks that suggest either abstract forms or highly stylized figures. And there are marks that have no clear parallel in any comparative rock art catalog, forms that researchers have noted, documented, and set aside without confident interpretation. The dating of the Judaculla rock carvings is genuinely uncertain. Soapstone is difficult to date directly, and the site lacks the stratified organic material that would allow reliable radiocarbon dating of associated activity. Stylistic analysis and regional comparison place the earliest carvings somewhere in the range of 3000 to 1000 BC, but some researchers have argued for earlier origins, and there is evidence that the surface was added to across multiple periods. That Judaculla rock, like Ughtasar and so many of the sites we have visited, was a place of return rather than a single moment of creation. The Cherokee Nation has maintained a continuous relationship with this site throughout its known history, and their oral traditions provide the oldest available interpretive framework. In Cherokee tradition, the rock is associated with Judaculla. Spelled variously, the name is an anglicization of the Cherokee Sulkalu, a powerful, giant, supernatural being described as a slant-eyed giant, a master of game and of the hunt, who was said to have leapt from his home in the mountains and landed on the rock, leaving his marks behind. The large print sometimes identified in the carvings is associated with his touch. This is not merely folklore in the dismissive sense in which that word is sometimes used. It is a living cultural tradition that encodes a relationship with the site, extending back further than any archaeological dating has yet confirmed. The Cherokee understanding of Judaculla rock as a place marked by a being of enormous power, a threshold between the human and the more than human world, is a framework that predates and outlasts every academic theory applied to the site. Archaeological interpretation has moved through several phases. Earlier researchers focused on identifying individual figures and attempting to decode specific symbols in isolation. More recent approaches have shifted toward understanding the site as a coherent composition, asking not what each mark means individually, but what the entire surface means as a unified, accumulated whole. This shift in perspective has opened new possibilities without necessarily resolving the fundamental questions. Some researchers working in the broader field of southeastern North American rock art have noted correspondences between certain Judaculla rock symbols and iconographic elements found in the Mississippian cultural tradition, the complex mound-building civilization that flourished across the American Southeast from approximately 800 AD to the time of European contact. Motifs associated with the Mississippian cosmological system, the upper world, the lower world, the layered structure of a universe in which human beings occupy a middle position between celestial and chthonic powers, appear to have analogues in some of the Judaculla rock imagery. Whether these connections represent cultural continuity, shared symbolic vocabulary, or coincidental similarity has not been resolved. Others have approached the site from an archaeoastronomical perspective, noting that the orientation of the carved surface and the positioning of certain marks may reflect deliberate alignment with solar or lunar events observable from the site. These analyses remain preliminary and contested. What no interpretive framework has yet fully accounted for is the sheer accumulative strangeness of the Judaculla rock surface. The feeling, reported consistently by researchers who spend extended time with it, that the marks are organized in ways that suggest meaning without surrendering it, that the surface has a grammar, a logic, an internal coherence that is just beyond the threshold of legibility, as though it is almost readable, as though, with one more piece of context, one more fragment of the tradition that produced it, it would open. The Cherokee elder and cultural preservationist who stands at this rock today and speaks of Solkalu is not describing a myth in the sense of something untrue. They are describing a relationship between a people and a place, and a set of forces that the rock was made to engage with. Whatever those forces were, the rock still holds their mark. Is the knowledge of what it means still alive somewhere, carried quietly in a tradition that simply hasn't been asked the right question yet? The marks on Judaculla rock speak in a language we have not yet learned to read, and perhaps that is the most honest thing we can say about so many of the surfaces we have moved through in this exploration. That they are legible in the sense of being clearly intentional, clearly organized, clearly the product of minds that knew exactly what they were doing. And yet the specific content of what they are doing remains just beyond our reach. We are close enough to feel the meaning without being able to hold it. But there is a category of ancient image that presents a different kind of challenge entirely. Not images whose meaning has been lost, but images whose meaning has never been surrendered. Carried forward in living tradition, actively maintained and renewed by the descendants of those who first made them. Images that are not archaeological artifacts in the conventional sense, because they are not in any meaningful way dead. They are alive. They are still being cared for. And they are among the most visually arresting and conceptually extraordinary images produced by any human culture anywhere on Earth. We are moving now to the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia, one of the most ancient, most remote, and most geologically spectacular landscapes on the planet. The Kimberley is a vast sandstone plateau of deeply eroded gorges, seasonal rivers, and rock shelters formed over hundreds of millions of years of wind and water working on some of the oldest exposed stone on Earth. In the wet season, the landscape floods and blooms. In the dry season, it retreats into a stark, burnt ochre stillness that feels, to anyone who has spent time in it, genuinely primordial. It is in the rock shelters and cave walls of this landscape that the Wandjina paintings live. The figures are immediately, unmistakably distinctive. They are large. Many are life-sized or larger, rendered on rock surfaces with a confidence and scale that commands attention. They are predominantly white, with features that include large, dark oval eyes, a nose, but no mouth. Around their heads, halos of radiating lines suggest either hair, headdress, or something that observers across many cultures and many decades have consistently described as resembling the corona of an eclipse, or the halo of a being radiating light. Their bodies, where depicted, are broad and frontal, facing the viewer directly, with an authority that does not invite casual interpretation. They are the Wandjina, sky beings, rain spirits, creator ancestors, in the cosmology of the Ngarenyin, Wunnambal, and Worora peoples, whose country this is and has been for tens of thousands of years. The age of the Wandjina paintings is genuinely extraordinary. While the tradition of painting and repainting these figures is ongoing, the images are regularly refreshed and renewed by custodians who maintain specific relationships with specific figures. The oldest layers of Wandjina imagery have been dated to at least 4,000 years ago, with some researchers arguing for considerably earlier origins based on stylistic analysis and the geological context of certain shelters. The broader Kimberley rock art tradition, of which the Wandjini form the most recent and most culturally active layer, extends back at least 17,000 years, and possibly much further. The cultural tradition surrounding the Wandjina is not a matter of historical reconstruction. It is living law. In Ngarinyan, Wunambal, and Warora tradition, the Wandjina are not representations of beings. They are the beings themselves, present in the rock, connected to the water, the clouds, the rain, and the fertility of the country. Each Wandjina figure is associated with a specific place, a specific clan, a specific set of responsibilities and relationships. The custodians of each figure carry obligations toward it, to maintain it, to renew its paint when it fades, to observe the protocols that govern access to it. This is not mythology in the archival sense. It is a system of living relationship with the landscape, encoded in image, maintained across tens of thousands of years of continuous cultural practice. And then there is the other conversation about the Wandjina, the one that arrives from outside the tradition, and that the tradition's custodians have, with considerable patience, been declining to endorse for several decades. The Wandjina have become, in certain circles, one of the most frequently cited examples of what is called the ancient astronaut hypothesis, the proposal that the figures, with their large eyes, their luminous halos, their mouthless faces, and apparently otherworldly bearing, are not representations of rain spirits at all, but depictions of extraterrestrial beings encountered by ancient Australians and preserved in paint across millennia. The visual case, such as it is, rests on the perceived resemblance between the Wandjina figures and the large-headed, dark-eyed beings described in modern UFO encounter accounts. This interpretation has been clearly, firmly, and repeatedly rejected by the Aboriginal custodians of the Wandjina tradition. The Wandjina are not aliens. They are ancestor beings of the Dreamtime, a cosmological and ontological framework so sophisticated, so internally coherent, and so deeply embedded in the landscape that reducing its most sacred images to science fiction is not merely academically incorrect, but culturally disrespectful in a way that the custodians have not been shy about naming. The mainstream archaeological and anthropological community is in full agreement with this position. But the wider conversation around the Wandjina reveals something worth pausing on. Not about extraterrestrials, but about us. About the persistent human difficulty, apparently, of encountering an image of sufficient power and strangeness, and simply accepting that it belongs to a tradition we do not fully understand. The reach for a framework, any framework, however improbable, that makes the unfamiliar feel categorized and therefore manageable. The Wandjina resist that reach. They always have. What is genuinely extraordinary about them, what no alternative theory has ever needed to explain away, because it is already extraordinary enough, is the continuity. The fact that a tradition of image-making, cosmological understanding, and custodial responsibility has been maintained in this landscape for a period of time that dwarfs the entire recorded history of every other civilization on Earth. That there are people alive today whose relationship with these paintings is not archaeological, but personal, familial, and spiritually active. That the knowledge of what the Wandjina are, and what they mean and how to care for them, has never been lost, because it was never abandoned. In a video full of mysteries, the Wandjina present perhaps the rarest thing we have encountered. Not an unanswered question, but an answer that most of the world has simply not yet learned to listen to properly. What would we understand about human history, about art, about the relationship between people and landscape, if we did? The Wandjina tradition endures because it was never let go, carried forward by custodians who understood that the relationship between people, image, and landscape is not a relic of the past, but a living responsibility, something that requires tending, renewal, and active presence across every generation. That continuity is, in its own way, the most remarkable thing we have encountered in this entire exploration. Not a mystery in the conventional sense, but a kind of answer. a demonstration that knowledge, when properly held, does not have to be lost. But not every tradition has been so carefully kept. Not every ancient marking has a living community standing beside it, ready to explain what it means and why it matters. Some images have outlasted the cultures that made them by such a margin that the connection between maker and mark has been completely severed, leaving behind only the physical evidence, the stone, and the unanswerable questions that gather around it like weather. And some of those orphaned images are very, very old. In the high desert of northwestern Nevada, in a landscape shaped by the enormous geological forces of the Basin and Range Province, there is a dry lake bed that was once something else entirely. Winnemucca Lake, named for the northern Paiute leader whose people lived in this region, is today a flat, pale expanse of cracked silt and alkaline deposits, the ghost of a body of water that retreated as the last ice age loosened its hold on the North American climate, and the region slowly dried into the desert it is now. At the lake's edge, rising from the pale lake bed in a series of dark volcanic limestone outcrops, there are boulders. And on those boulders, on the faces that were once at the waterline, or just above it, of a lake that no longer exists, there are petroglyphs. They are deeply carved, the grooves cut into the limestone with a confidence and depth that speaks to sustained effort and deliberate intention. The forms themselves are predominantly abstract. Curvilinear shapes, nested crescents, intricate geometric configurations, forms that resemble stylized trees or branching patterns, and a series of deeply incised designs that have no obvious parallel in the broader catalog of North American rock art. Some panels are densely covered, the marks overlapping and layering in ways that suggest multiple periods of use. Others are more spare, a single, carefully composed image on a surface that could have held many more. The Winnemucca Lake petroglyphs were known to researchers for much of the 20th century, but their true significance became apparent only in 2013, when a study led by geochemist Larry Benson and colleagues published a dating analysis that produced results striking enough to reframe the entire site. Using a combination of uranium series dating of the carbonate layers coating the petroglyphs and correlating these coatings with the known water level history of the lake, reconstructed from tufa formations and sediment records, the research team concluded that the petroglyphs had been carved when the lake surface was at a specific elevation. That elevation corresponded to a period when the lake was at high water, which the geological record placed between approximately 14,800 BC and 13,100 BC, with a secondary possible window around 11,300 to 10,500 BC. At the lower end of that range, the Winnemucca Lake petroglyphs would be among the oldest known rock art in North America, older than any previously confirmed carved or painted site on the continent. At the upper end, they remain extraordinary. Either way, the implications are significant. The dating placed the carvers of these petroglyphs in a period when the Americas were in the earliest phases of human habitation according to the conventional archaeological model, when the descendants of the first migrants across the Bering Land Bridge were still in the broad view, establishing themselves across an unfamiliar continent. To find in this period evidence not merely of human presence, but of sustained, skilled, symbolically complex artistic activity, is to be reminded, again, that the conventional model of early human cognition consistently underestimates what was already there. The mainstream response to the Benson dating was engaged and largely accepting of the methodology, while noting, as is appropriate, that dating rock art through secondary coatings carries inherent uncertainties. The carbonate layers date the minimum age of the marks. The petroglyphs must be at least as old as the coating, and possibly older. The correlation with lake-level history adds a further interpretive layer that, while carefully argued, involves its own assumptions. Most researchers consider the dating credible and significant, while acknowledging that absolute certainty is not available. What the dating cannot tell us is anything about who made these images, or what they meant. The northern Paiute people, whose ancestral territory includes the Winnemucca Lake area, have lived in this region for thousands of years. But even within their tradition, there is no specific cultural memory that connects directly to these particular petroglyphs at this particular age. The gap between the makers and any surviving tradition is, in this case, simply too large. Whatever group carved these stones during the late Pleistocene or early Holocene, whatever their language, their beliefs, their understanding of the world, left no direct descendants whose knowledge of the site has been preserved. The images themselves offer limited guidance. Their abstract character makes them resistant to straightforward iconographic interpretation. The curvilinear forms and nested shapes have analogues in rock art traditions from many parts of the world, but correspondence in form does not necessarily imply correspondence in meaning. The branching, tree-like configurations have attracted particular attention. Some researchers have suggested connections to representations of water, of celestial phenomena, or of cosmological structures found in other ancient traditions. These suggestions are speculative, and their authors generally acknowledge as much. What remains, when the dating debates and the iconographic speculation are set aside, is the simple, vertiginous fact of the thing. Someone stood at the edge of a lake in the Great Basin of North America, in a world that was still emerging from the last ice age, with a stone tool in their hand, and carved these shapes into a boulder with care and purpose. The lake was full. The climate was shifting. The continent around them was, in human terms, new. And they made art. Not survival tools, not weapons, not shelters. Art, symbols. Marks that were meant to mean something, to someone, in a way that outlasted the moment of their making. The lake dried up. The culture vanished into the deep past. The meaning evaporated with them. But the marks remained, waiting at the waterline of a lake that no longer exists, for a world that finally had the tools to ask how old they were. What were they trying to say, those first artists at the edge of an Ice Age lake? And is there anyone left, anywhere, who still knows? The artists at Winnemucca Lake were working at the edge of something. The edge of a lake, the edge of an Ice Age. The edge, perhaps, of a world that was in the process of becoming the world we now inhabit. The climate shifting, the megafauna disappearing, the great ice sheets pulling back from the land they had covered for tens of thousands of years. There is something fitting about finding their marks at a waterline, that transitional zone between one element and another, between the submerged and the exposed, between the known and the unknown. So many of the mysteries in this exploration exist at edges. The threshold of the Aramu Muru doorway, the boundary between the desert and the living world that the cave of swimmers once occupied. The rim of the Karahunj Plateau, where the stones pointed from earth toward sky. Edges seem to be where human beings have always done their most serious thinking, where they have felt most compelled to leave a mark, build a structure, draw a line. And now we arrive at a mystery that is, quite literally, a line. A very, very long line. Jordan is a country that wears its history openly. Wherever you travel in its landscape, from the northern highlands to the Wadi Rum Desert in the south, from the Jordan Valley in the west to the basalt fields of the eastern steppe, the ground is littered with the accumulated residue of human civilization stretching back into deep prehistory. Neolithic villages, Bronze Age fortresses, Nabatean trade routes, Roman roads, Byzantine churches, Islamic citadels. The layers are so compressed, so continuous, that in some areas an archaeologist can move through 5,000 years of human history in a single afternoon's walking. It is in the eastern and southern reaches of this landscape, the arid steppe and semi-desert regions known as the Badia, that one of the most puzzling and least discussed ancient structures in the entire Middle East runs its quiet, largely invisible course. The Khatt Shebib. The name translates approximately as the Line of Shebib, a reference to an Umayyad governor named Shebib ibn Abi Sufyan, to whom the wall was attributed in early Arab tradition. That attribution, as we will see, is almost certainly wrong, but the name has stayed, as names tend to do, long after the reason for it has been called into question. The Khatt Shebib is a wall. Or more precisely, it is a discontinuous series of low stone walls, field boundaries, and linear structures that runs in a broadly northeast to southwest direction across the Jordanian landscape for a distance of approximately 150 kilometers. In places, it survives to a height of over a meter. In many more places, it has collapsed to a single course of stones, or reduced to a barely visible line of rubble, traceable only from above. It is not, by the standards of great ancient walls, an imposing structure. The individual sections are modest, typically built from local fieldstones without mortar, in a single or double course, sometimes with the addition of small towers or enclosures at irregular intervals. What is not modest is its extent. 150 kilometers, running across terrain that ranges from cultivable highland to near desert, crossing wadis and ridgelines and ancient tracks with a consistency of direction that implies planning on a scale that is difficult to reconcile with any simple, local purpose. And the main wall is not alone. Survey work conducted in recent decades has revealed a network of associated walls, branches, and parallel structures that extend the overall system considerably beyond the primary line, suggesting that what was built here was not a single wall, but a landscape-scale infrastructure project of considerable ambition. The first modern scholarly attention to the Khatt Shebib came from the British officer and explorer Alec Kirkbride, who noted its existence in the 1940s. For several decades, it remained a footnote, mentioned in regional surveys, visited occasionally, but never made the subject of sustained archaeological investigation. It was not until aerial and satellite photography became widely available that the true scale of the structure began to be appreciated. Seen from above, the Khatt Shebib resolves from a local curiosity into something that demands explanation. When was it built? The honest answer is that we do not know with precision. The attribution to the Umayyad governor Shebib has been largely dismissed by researchers, not least because early Arab sources that mention the wall suggest it was already ancient when the Umayyad period began in the 7th century AD. Archaeological survey of the wall and its associated features has produced material, pottery, worked stone, associated structures, that points toward a broad range of periods, with the most consistent evidence suggesting construction activity sometime in the late Nabatean or early Roman period, roughly the first few centuries AD. But some researchers have proposed earlier origins, potentially reaching back into the Iron Age or even the Bronze Age, with later phases of repair and addition complicating the picture. The absence of systematic excavation along the wall's length means that these questions remain genuinely open. Large sections have never been formally studied. The dating evidence that exists is patchy and localized. What was it for? This is where the Khatt Shebib becomes most interesting and most resistant to tidy explanation. The most widely proposed function is agricultural, specifically that the wall served as a boundary between the settled agricultural zones to the west and the pastoral nomadic territories to the east, regulating the movement of livestock and preventing the overgrazing of cultivated land. This kind of agro-pastoral boundary wall is known from other parts of the ancient Near East and would be consistent with the Khatt Shebib's general orientation, which broadly follows the ecological transition zone between the fertile uplands and the arid steppe. This explanation is reasonable. It may well be correct, at least in part, but it generates as many questions as it answers. A boundary wall of 150 kilometers, plus associated structures, requires an extraordinary investment of collective labor and organizational capacity to build and maintain. It implies a central authority capable of planning and executing a project at landscape scale, and of sustaining the political will to see it through. In the region and period to which the Khatt Shebib is most often attributed, what authority was capable of this? The Nabatean kingdom, whose sophisticated hydraulic engineering and trade infrastructure demonstrate exactly the kind of organizational capacity the wall would require, is one candidate. But the fit is not perfect, and no inscription, no document, no historical source has ever been found that directly references the construction of the Khatt Shebib or identifies the authority behind it. We are building a case from circumstantial evidence and analogy because the direct evidence simply does not exist. Some researchers have proposed that the wall's function was not purely agricultural, but also military or political, that it served as a demarcation of territorial control, a visible statement of sovereignty across a landscape that was perpetually contested between settled and nomadic powers. The towers and enclosures associated with certain sections of the wall are more consistent with surveillance or control functions than with simple field boundaries. Whether these features were part of the original construction or later additions to an existing agricultural boundary remains unclear. There is also the question of what the wall was not. It is not, in any obvious sense, a defensive wall in the military meaning of the term. It is too low, too discontinuous, and too lacking in the reinforcing features, ditches, bastions, gates, that characterize walls built to stop an army. Whatever it was keeping in or keeping out, it was not an invading force in the conventional sense. The satellite imagery that first revealed the full extent of the Khatt Shebib has also raised a more recent and in some ways more intriguing question. Analysis of the broader landscape around the wall has revealed that it is not the only linear feature of its kind in the region. The Jordanian Badia contains a number of other ancient wall systems, field boundaries, and linear structures that have received even less scholarly attention than the Khatt Shebib itself. The relationship between these features, whether they were built by the same culture, in the same period, as part of the same overall landscape management system, has barely begun to be investigated. We may be looking, in other words, not at a single anomalous wall, but at the visible remnants of a comprehensive, landscape-scale human project whose full extent has not yet been mapped, whose builders have not yet been identified, and whose purpose has not yet been adequately explained. 150 kilometers of stone running across the Jordanian desert in a direction that someone, at some point, decided was exactly right. Not randomly, not approximately, with a consistency of intention that carried across a distance that would take days to walk, that required its builders to hold a single purpose in mind across terrain and time and the inevitable friction of large collective endeavor. They knew what they were building. They knew why they were building it. That knowledge has not survived. The wall has. And somewhere along those 150 kilometers of mostly unstudied stone, in a section that has never been excavated, in a tower that has never been properly documented, in a scatter of pottery that no one has yet thought to date, there may be the piece of evidence that finally tells us who these builders were and what they believed they were drawing across the face of the land. It is still out there, quiet, low, and patient in the Jordanian desert, waiting for someone to follow it all the way to the end. The Khatt Shebib was a line drawn across a landscape, 150 kilometers of patient, deliberate stone running in a direction that someone understood with a clarity we have not yet recovered. And what it shares with so many of the structures and surfaces we have been moving through, the Sajama Lines, the Cochno stone, the Judaculla rock, the Karahunj standing stones, is that quality of organized intention operating at a scale that exceeds immediate, practical necessity. These were not things built merely to solve a problem. They were things built to say something, to mean something, to impose a shape of human understanding onto the physical world in a way that was meant to last. Sometimes that shape is a line, sometimes it is a wall, and sometimes, in one of the most quietly extraordinary cases in this entire exploration, it is a perfect sphere. The Diquis Delta of southwestern Costa Rica is a region of extraordinary biological richness. Rivers descend from the Talamanca mountain range and spread across a broad coastal plain before reaching the Pacific, creating a mosaic of rainforest, wetland, and alluvial plain that has supported human habitation for thousands of years. The landscape is lush in the way that only equatorial lowland rainforest can be. Layered, dense, humming with life. The kind of place where the jungle reclaims anything that isn't actively defended against it within a matter of years. It is in this landscape, buried in the soil, half hidden by vegetation, scattered across the delta and on the Isla del Caño offshore, that the stone spheres of Costa Rica were first encountered by workers clearing land for a United Fruit Company banana plantation in the 1930s. The workers and their supervisors and the archaeologists who followed them found objects that did not immediately make sense in the context of pre-Columbian Central American archaeology. Stone spheres, hundreds of them, ranging in size from a few centimeters to nearly 2.5 meters in diameter, weighing, in the largest examples, up to 16 tons, and shaped, this is the detail that continues to astonish, with a spherical precision that approaches perfection. Measurements conducted on the largest and best preserved examples have found deviations from a true sphere of less than 0.5%. In objects carved from hard granodiorite and gabbro, without metal tools, without the benefit of precision instruments as we understand them, this is a level of accuracy that is, to put it plainly, almost inexplicable. The largest and finest of these spheres, the one that has come to anchor discussions of the phenomenon at its most extraordinary, is associated with the site at Palmar Sur, in the heart of the Dikis Delta. But the spheres found in the region around the town of Buga and across the broader Dikis archaeological zone represent the full range of the tradition. From modest, roughly worked early examples to the astonishing, near-perfect geometric forms that have made this one of the most discussed and least understood phenomena in pre-Columbian archaeology. The spheres are now UNESCO World Heritage listed, recognized as part of the pre-Columbian chiefdom settlements with stone spheres of the Diki. That recognition reflects the growing understanding of how significant, and how poorly understood, they remain. What do we actually know? The spheres were made by the people of the Dikis culture, a complex chiefdom society that flourished in this region from approximately 700 AD to the time of Spanish contact in the 16th century, though some researchers argue that the tradition of sphere making began earlier, potentially as far back as 200 BC. They were carved from several types of stone: granodiorite, gabbro, limestone, and sandstone, some of which was quarried in the Talamanca foothills, tens of kilometers from where the finished spheres were ultimately placed. They were transported somehow across rivers and through dense jungle to locations that appear to have been chosen with deliberate intent. The methods by which they were made are not fully understood. The process almost certainly involved the progressive reduction of a roughly spherical roughout, using a combination of percussion, pecking, grinding, and possibly the use of abrasive materials to achieve the final surface. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that skilled stoneworkers can produce reasonably spherical forms using these techniques. What it has not fully explained is how the finest Dikis spheres achieved their extraordinary accuracy. Accuracy that, in the largest examples, would be challenging to replicate today without precision measuring equipment. The context in which the spheres were found adds further layers of complexity. Many were not found in their original positions. The banana plantation clearances of the 1930s displaced numerous spheres without recording their locations or associations. Others were moved by collectors, by road builders, by landowners who used them as garden ornaments without any awareness of their significance. Some were damaged or destroyed. The looting and displacement of the spheres in the decades following their discovery represents one of the more significant losses in Central American archaeological history, not just of objects, but of the contextual information that would have told us most about how they were used. What careful excavation of undisturbed sites has revealed is that the spheres appear to have been associated with the residences of high-status individuals, chiefs, in the hierarchical terminology of chiefdom societies, and were likely symbols of political and spiritual authority. They were sometimes arranged in lines or geometric groupings that suggest deliberate, meaningful spatial organization. Some arrangements appear to point toward astronomical features, alignments with the cardinal directions, or with the rising and setting points of the sun at solstice and equinox. These alignments, if intentional, would connect the Dikis spheres to the same astronomical awareness we have encountered at Karahunj, at the Sajama Lines, at Stonehenge, and dozens of other ancient sites worldwide, a pattern of sky watching and sky marking that appears to be one of the most consistent features of human intellectual life across cultures and millennia. But the astronomical interpretations remain contested. The displacement of so many spheres from their original contexts makes it difficult to distinguish genuine alignments from coincidental ones. The evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive. The mainstream archaeological position, that the spheres were symbols of chiefly power and status, made by skilled artisans working within a tradition of technically demanding craft production used to mark the residences and authority of political elites, is well supported by what contextual evidence survives. It is a reasonable and coherent interpretation. What it does not fully resolve is the precision. Why does it matter exactly that the spheres are so close to perfect? A symbol of status could be spherical without being this spherical. The deviation from a true sphere in the finest examples is so small as to be essentially invisible to the naked eye. You would have to measure very carefully to detect it. The makers of these spheres were pursuing an accuracy that went beyond what display or symbolic function required. An accuracy that implies either an aesthetic commitment to geometric perfection for its own sake, or a technical purpose that demanded exactness for reasons we have not identified. Some researchers have proposed that the spheres may have had an acoustic function, that their near-perfect geometry produces specific resonant properties when struck, and that this sonic quality may have been part of their ritual or ceremonial significance. Small-scale acoustic testing has produced intriguing results. Full systematic study of this hypothesis has not been conducted. Others have returned to the question of the quarry sources and the transport problem. The largest spheres weighed 16 tons and were moved without wheeled vehicles or draft animals across challenging jungle terrain. The logistics of this transport imply a level of organizational capacity, technical knowledge, and collective labor mobilization that continues to exceed what the conventional picture of Dica's society comfortably accommodates. Not because the Diki were incapable, the spheres themselves are proof of extraordinary capability, but because the specific techniques they use to move multi-ton objects across the Diki's delta have left no clear trace in the archaeological record. How did they do it? We have hypotheses. We have experimental reconstructions using rollers, sledges, and large labor teams. We do not have certainty. And there is one more dimension to the Buga Sphere story that tends to get lost in the technical discussions of precision and transport. These objects were made with evident care, with evident pride. The finest of them required sustained, skilled attention over a period of time that would have been considerable. Weeks, months, perhaps longer. Someone looked at a rough block of granodiorite and saw inside it a perfect sphere, and worked patiently until the stone became what they imagined. That act of imagination, the conception of geometric perfection, and the commitment to realize it in stone, in a jungle, without any of the tools we would consider necessary, is itself a kind of mystery. Not a mystery that requires supernatural explanation, but a mystery that asks us to reconsider again what we think we mean when we talk about the limits of ancient human capability. The sphere sits in the earth of the Diki's Delta, or in a museum case, or, too many of them, in someone's garden, stripped of context and meaning. Perfect, silent, patient. What were they really for? And in the undisturbed sites that remain beneath the jungle floor of southwestern Costa Rica, the ones that the banana companies never reached, the ones that looters never found, are there arrangements of these spheres still in place, still pointing in the directions their makers intended, still encoding something we have not yet thought to ask? The Diki spheres pursued perfection. That is the thing that stays with you, not just their size, not just the logistics of their creation and transport, but the fact that whoever made them cared, deeply and demonstrably, about geometric exactness that went beyond any obvious functional requirement. They were reaching for something, an ideal, a form that existed in the mind before it existed in the stone, and that the stone was then patiently persuaded to become. It is a recognizably human impulse, the desire to make something that matches an internal vision with as much fidelity as the material world allows. And it connects the Diki's sphere makers to every other culture we have visited in this exploration, to the carvers of Judaculla rock, to the painters of the Wandjina, to the builders of Karahunj, all of them reaching, in their different ways, toward something that mattered enough to justify extraordinary effort. But what happens when that reaching produces something that doesn't fit? When the objects that emerge from an ancient context are not merely extraordinary, but actively contradictory? Things that, if taken at face value, would require a fundamental revision of everything we think we know about the ancient world. That is the question that has surrounded a collection of clay figurines from central Mexico for the better part of a century. A collection so large, so strange, and so contested that it occupies a unique and deeply uncomfortable position in the landscape of archaeological mystery. Too significant to ignore, too problematic to simply accept. The town of Acambaro sits in the state of Guanajuato in central Mexico, in a dry agricultural landscape of mesquite and scrub that has been inhabited since deep prehistory. It is not a dramatic place. It does not announce itself as a site of archaeological significance. And yet, beginning in 1944, a German merchant named Waldemar Julsrud, who had lived in Mexico for decades and had a serious interest in pre-Columbian artifacts, began acquiring, from a local farmer named Odilon Tinajero, a collection of clay figurines that would eventually number in the tens of thousands. 32,000 figurines, by the count most frequently cited. Some sources place the number higher. They were being dug, Tinajero said, from a hillside on the outskirts of Acambaro called El Toro, and from the beginning the collection was remarkable for reasons that went well beyond its size. The figurines depicted humans, they depicted animals, they depicted scenes of daily life, ritual activity, and what appeared to be narrative sequences. All of this would have been consistent with a significant pre-Columbian ceramic tradition, unusual in scale, but not in kind. But among the tens of thousands of ordinary figures were others that were anything but ordinary. Figurines depicting, with apparent anatomical specificity, dinosaurs. Not stylized monsters. Not mythological creatures with ambiguous forms. Figures that, to observers with a knowledge of paleontology, resembled specific genera. Creatures whose existence was unknown to science until the 19th century, and whose detailed anatomical characteristics were not fully described until the 20th. Brachiosaurus-like long-necked sauropods. Theropods in postures consistent with modern reconstructions. Creatures with the distinctive physical profiles of animals that, according to the geological and paleontological record, went extinct approximately 66 million years ago. If these figurines were genuinely ancient, genuinely made by a pre-Columbian culture in the centuries or millennia before Spanish contact, then they would represent evidence of something that conventional science considers impossible. Human beings and non-avian dinosaurs did not coexist. The fossil record on this point is not ambiguous. The gap between the last non-avian dinosaurs and the first anatomically modern humans is measured in tens of millions of years. And yet here, in a collection of clay objects dug from a hillside in central Mexico, were figures that looked like dinosaurs. The archaeological establishment's response was swift and largely dismissive. Almost from the beginning, the Acambaro collection was treated with deep skepticism by mainstream researchers. The circumstances of its acquisition, purchased from a single local source, excavated without professional oversight, growing at a rate that seemed implausible for a genuine ancient deposit, raised immediate red flags. The site itself was investigated by several archaeologists, including in the 1950s by Charles de Peso of the Amerind Foundation, whose examination led him to conclude that the figurines were modern fabrications, made by Tinajero and his associates to sell to the eager Julsrud, whose willingness to pay by the piece provided an obvious financial incentive for production. De Peso's assessment became the dominant position. The Acambaro figures were fakes. Julsrud had been deceived, or had deceived himself, and the collection, however visually striking, had no archaeological validity. This conclusion has never been definitively overturned, but it has also never been as completely settled as its confident assertion might suggest. Several aspects of the collection have continued to trouble even skeptically inclined researchers. Thermoluminescence dating conducted on samples from the collection in the 1960s by the University of Pennsylvania initially returned dates of approximately 2500 BC, genuinely ancient. These results were subsequently questioned when it was pointed out that the dating method requires objects to have been properly buried and undisturbed, conditions that could not be guaranteed for the Acambaro figures. The dates were set aside, but they were not explained away. The laboratory that produced them did not conclude they were wrong, only that the contextual uncertainty made them unreliable. A later thermoluminescent study, conducted in the 1970s, produced dates ranging from 1100 BC to 4500 BC across different samples. Again, the results were questioned on methodological grounds related to the uncertain provenance of the objects. Again, the questions were legitimate. Again, the results were not definitively disproven. They were deemed inconclusive. The figure of Tinahero himself is central to the fraud hypothesis, and yet his role is less simple than the standard account suggests. Local investigators who interviewed Tinahero and his family found accounts that were not straightforwardly consistent with a fabrication operation of the scale required, producing tens of thousands of figurines, many of them complex, detailed, and fired with the surface characteristics of aged ceramics, and burying them in ways that fooled multiple independent observers is not a trivial undertaking. The practical logistics of such a fraud, conducted by a single farmer and his family without detection across years of excavation, have never been fully worked through by those who assert it as fact. None of this constitutes proof of authenticity. Let that be clearly stated. But the dismissal of the Acambaro collection has, in some quarters, been as unrigorous as the overclaiming of those who point to it as evidence of human-dinosaur coexistence. The evidence for fraud, while circumstantially strong, rests on a set of assumptions about what was possible and what was not that have themselves never been fully tested. There is also a more nuanced question lurking beneath the binary of authentic versus fake. Even if many or most of the Acambaro figures are modern fabrications, made by Tinahero in the 1940s to satisfy Julsrud's demand. Is the entire collection of 32,000 objects uniformly of the same origin? Were there genuine pre-Columbian pieces mixed in with later productions? Was Tinahero supplementing a real discovery with manufactured additions, as has happened at other sites where local people have recognized the financial opportunity presented by archaeological interest? These questions have not been carefully investigated, in part because the fraud hypothesis settled so firmly over the collection that detailed study became professionally risky for any archaeologist who wished to maintain their standing. What is perhaps most revealing about the Acambaro figures is not the objects themselves, but the reaction they provoke. The collection sits at the intersection of two very human tendencies: the tendency to believe too quickly in things that confirm a preferred narrative, and the tendency to dismiss too quickly things that threaten an established one. Both tendencies have been fully on display in the century of debate surrounding these figurines, and neither has served the cause of honest inquiry particularly well. Somewhere in a storage facility associated with the Museo del Pueblo de Guanajuato, or in private collections descended from Julsrud's original acquisition, the figures sit, thousands of them, clay and silent, waiting with the same patience we have encountered everywhere in this exploration. A human figure holds what appears to be a long-necked animal on a lead. A multi-ton predator crouches in a posture that paleontologists would recognize. A creature whose skeleton was not scientifically described until 1877 sits in the palm of a hand, rendered in fired clay. Are they ancient? Are they modern? Are they, somehow, both? The clay does not answer. The hillside at El Toro has been excavated and re-examined and argued over, and the argument continues. And the figures themselves, 32,000 of them, depicting a world that either never existed or that we have not yet found the courage to fully reckon with, remain exactly what they have always been. A question that no one has yet been brave enough, or careful enough, to answer properly. The Acambaro figures leave us in a place of genuine uncertainty, not the comfortable uncertainty of a mystery that simply lacks enough evidence yet, the kind where more careful excavation, more rigorous dating, more patient analysis might eventually produce a clear answer, but a deeper, more unsettling uncertainty, the kind that arises when the question itself has become so entangled with the agendas of those arguing about it true believers on one side, dismissive skeptics on the other. That the object at the center of the debate has almost disappeared beneath the weight of what people want it to mean. That tension between what we want to find and what the evidence actually shows runs through the entire history of archaeological discovery, and it becomes most acute when the objects in question are not merely old or strange or culturally anomalous, but when they appear, at first encounter, to predate not just human civilization, but human existence entirely, when the mystery is not historical, but geological, when the question being asked is not who made this, but whether anything made it at all. In the northern Cape and northwest provinces of South Africa, in the region surrounding the town of Ottosdal and the broader Klerksdorp district, there are pyrophyllite deposits, a soft metamorphic mineral also known as wonderstone, that have been commercially mined for decades. Pyrophyllite is used in a range of industrial applications, and the South African deposits are among the most extensive in the world. The mining is routine, unglamorous, industrial. Men go into the earth and extract material that is processed and sold and turned into practical things. And for as long as the mining has been active, the miners have been finding something else. Spheres. Small, dense, metallic-looking objects embedded in the pyrophyllite matrix, ranging in size from roughly 1 centimeter to 10 centimeters in diameter. They are found individually and in clusters. They are dark, typically blue-gray or reddish-brown in color, with a metallic sheen that seems inconsistent with simple mineral formation. Many are remarkably regular in shape, approaching spherical with a smoothness that draws attention. And a significant proportion of them have something even more arresting: grooves. Typically 1, 2, or 3 parallel grooves running around their circumference, in positions that suggest deliberate symmetrical placement. The miners began collecting them. Word spread. Eventually, examples reached researchers, and the objects entered the scientific literature under a variety of names. Klerksdorp spheres being the most common, though they are also referred to as Ottosdal spheres, or, in more popular literature, by names considerably more dramatic than either. The pyrophyllite deposits in which they are found are genuinely ancient. The geological strata containing the spheres have been dated to the Precambrian era, specifically to approximately 2.8 billion years ago. This is not a controversial dating. It is established geology, cross-referenced and confirmed by multiple independent analyses. The rock is 2.8 billion years old, and this is where the story, for a certain category of reader and viewer, becomes extraordinary in a way that geology alone cannot contain. If the spheres are as old as the rock that contains them, if they formed within or alongside the pyrophyllite 2.8 billion years ago, then they predate not just human civilization, but the entire history of complex multicellular life on Earth. They predate the Cambrian explosion. They predate fish, insects, plants, and every animal that has ever walked, swum, or flown on this planet. In the popular literature of ancient mysteries and alternative history, this dating has been seized upon as evidence of something extraordinary, of manufactured objects, of intelligent design, of a civilization or intelligence operating on Earth before the fossil record contains any trace of anything that could have made them. The claim, stated plainly, is that the Klerksdorp spheres are 2.8 billion-year-old artifacts, manufactured objects of unknown origin embedded in some of the oldest accessible rock on the planet's surface. It is a remarkable claim, and it is one that geology, examined carefully, does not support. The scientific consensus on the Klerksdorp spheres is clear and well established. They are natural concretions, objects formed through entirely understood geological processes in which minerals precipitate around a nucleus within a host rock, producing rounded, sometimes strikingly regular forms over geological time. Concretions are found in rock formations worldwide, in an enormous variety of shapes and sizes, and the processes that produce them are well documented and well understood. The spherical or subspherical shape of many Klerksdorp specimens is a natural consequence of the radial, outward growth pattern characteristic of concretion formation. The grooves. The feature that most strongly suggests artificial manufacture to non-specialist observers are interpreted by geologists as the result of differential mineral composition within the concretion itself, or as the traces of natural fracture planes in the surrounding rock that influenced how the concretion grew. This explanation is not speculative. It is grounded in detailed mineralogical analysis of the spheres themselves, including examination of their internal structure, which shows the layered, concentric organization characteristic of concretionary growth, rather than anything consistent with manufacturing or machining. So the scientific answer is, in broad terms, settled. The Klerksdorp Spheres are natural. They are not artifacts. They were not made by anyone. And yet, there are aspects of the Klerksdorp Sphere phenomenon that even a fully satisfied acceptance of the geological explanation leaves sitting in an interesting place. The grooves remain the most visually striking feature, and while the geological explanation for them is accepted by specialists, it has not been communicated with the kind of detailed, accessible clarity that would allow a non-specialist to fully evaluate it. The popular literature on the spheres, which reaches vastly more people than the specialist geological literature, has been dominated by the extraordinary claim rather than the careful debunking, and the debunking, where it exists in accessible form, often feels dismissive rather than genuinely explanatory. The result is a persistent gap between what geologists know and what the broader public encounters. There is also a more philosophically interesting dimension to the Klerksdorp Sphere story, one that the geological explanation, correct as it is, actually deepens rather than dissolves. The natural processes that produce these objects, the slow, patient precipitation of minerals around a nucleus over geological time, the gradual emergence of near-spherical forms in symmetrical grooves through purely chemical and physical processes operating across millions of years, are themselves extraordinary. The universe, left to its own devices across sufficient time and under the right conditions, produces objects that look to human eyes like they were made with intention, like they were shaped by a mind that cared about geometry and symmetry and regular form. This is not a new observation. Nature produces spirals, hexagons, branching fractals, and radial symmetries throughout the living and non-living world. The Klerksdorp Spheres are, in this sense, one of the more dramatic examples of a much broader phenomenon, the deep mathematical order that underlies physical reality expressing itself in forms that our pattern-recognizing minds immediately read as designed. The reason the spheres look manufactured is not because someone made them. It is because the same geometric principles that guide human craft also govern mineral growth, fluid dynamics, and the physics of radial symmetry. Nature and craft are drawing from the same underlying order. That is, when you sit with it, genuinely more interesting than the ancient civilization hypothesis. It is a window into the deep structure of physical reality, the way mathematical law expresses itself in stone across billions of years without any mind to direct it. But the question of why certain examples of the Klerksdorp spheres are quite so regular, why specific specimens display groove placements and surface consistency that exceed what the average concretion produces, has not been exhaustively addressed in the specialist literature. Most geological analyses have focused on demonstrating the natural origin of the phenomenon in general, rather than accounting in detail for every specimen across the full range of variation. There may be nothing more to say. The geological explanation may fully account for all of it, or there may be within the broader population of Klerksdorp spheres, collected by miners over decades, held in private collections, sitting in shoeboxes in houses across the Northern Cape, specimens that present features not yet examined by anyone with the tools to properly characterize them. The Earth is old in a way that resists genuine comprehension. 2.8 billion years is not a number the human mind can actually hold. It can only be named, approximated, gestured toward. And in rock that old, embedded in layers of stone that were forming when the most complex life on Earth was a single-celled organism in a shallow sea, small dark spheres with symmetrical grooves have been waiting for the planet to cool, for life to emerge, for intelligence to develop, for someone to dig a mine in the northern Cape of South Africa and pull them out of the earth and hold them in a hand and wonder what they were. They are 2.8 billion years old, and we have only been asking questions about them for a few decades. What else is down there, in rock that old, that we haven't thought to look for yet? The Klerksdorp Spheres remind us of something important: that the line between what looks manufactured and what is entirely natural is not always as clear as we would like it to be. That our pattern-recognizing minds, the same minds that carved symbols into the Cochno stone and painted the Wandjina and pressed marks into the clay of Vinca pottery, are exquisitely, sometimes dangerously, sensitive to the appearance of intention. We see design where there is only physics. We see messages where there is only geology. We see the hand of a maker in the work of deep time. And this tendency, this profound, deeply human susceptibility to finding meaning in form, cuts in two directions at once. It leads us toward genuine discovery, toward the recognition of real ancient intelligence in objects and sites that skeptics would dismiss too quickly. And it leads us, sometimes, toward something else entirely. Toward the construction of narratives so compelling, so internally consistent, so satisfying in their implications, that the question of whether they are true becomes almost secondary to the question of whether we want them to be. The story of the Burrows cave artifact sits precisely at that fault line. In 1982, a man named Russell Burrows claimed to have stumbled upon a cave in rural Illinois, the precise location of which he has never publicly disclosed, while hiking in the bluffs and hollows of the southern part of the state. What he found inside, according to his account, was extraordinary. A stone chamber of considerable size containing human remains, mummies, he said, along with hundreds and eventually thousands of stone tablets carved and inscribed with images and symbols unlike anything associated with any known Native American culture. The images on the tablets, as Burrows described them, and as the objects that subsequently entered public circulation appeared to show, depicted human figures in styles that seemed Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, or North African in character. There were what appeared to be Egyptian-style profiles, figures wearing clothing and carrying objects suggestive of ancient Old World cultures. Scripts that researchers comparing them to known ancient writing systems identified as bearing resemblance to, depending on who was looking, ancient Libyan, Phoenician, Iberian, Meroitic, or other Mediterranean and Near Eastern scripts. The implications, if the artifacts were genuine, were immense. A cave in Illinois containing the remains and material culture of ancient Old World travelers would require a complete revision of the accepted history of pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the Americas. It would mean that seafarers from the ancient Mediterranean or North Africa had not only crossed the Atlantic, but had penetrated deep into the North American interior, deep enough to reach southern Illinois, and had left behind a substantial body of material evidence. The story gathered momentum through the late 1980s and 1990s, particularly within the community of researchers interested in pre-Columbian transatlantic contact, a field that occupies a fraught position between serious scholarship and fringe speculation, containing both legitimate archaeologists asking genuine questions about early maritime contact and enthusiasts whose conclusions consistently outrun their evidence. Several researchers examined the artifacts that Burrows made available: stone tablets, engraved stones, small carved objects, and produced analyses that supported, in varying degrees, their apparent Old World connections. Comparisons were drawn to specific ancient scripts. Iconographic analyses identified motifs consistent with ancient Egyptian, Ptolemaic, or North African artistic traditions. A small number of academics with relevant credentials expressed cautious interest. The mainstream archaeological response was, from the beginning, deeply skeptical, and for reasons that were not simply reflexive conservatism. The fundamental problem with the Burrows cave artifacts is the one that haunts every artifact collection of this type: provenance. Burrows has never revealed the location of the cave. No independent archaeologist has ever examined the site. No excavation has been conducted under controlled conditions. No stratigraphic context exists for any of the objects. Everything that is known about the collection comes from Burrows himself, from the objects he chose to release, and from the analyses conducted on those objects by researchers who had no way of verifying where they came from. Without provenance, without the ability to confirm that the objects were found where and how the claimant says they were found, archaeological analysis of the objects themselves can demonstrate only what they are, not where they came from or when they were made. And what the objects are, according to the analyses that have been conducted, is genuinely ambiguous. Some researchers who examined the tablets found the carving style inconsistent with genuine antiquity. Too regular, too clean, lacking the specific wear patterns and mineral deposits that accumulate on objects of genuine age buried in soil for centuries or millennia. The stone types used for some tablets were identified as local Illinois material, which would be consistent either with ancient inhabitants using locally available stone or with a modern fabricator working with whatever was at hand. Thermoluminescence and other dating attempts on selected artifacts produced inconsistent results, some suggesting age, others not. None of the dating was conducted under conditions rigorous enough to be considered definitive. The script comparisons, while superficially striking, were challenged by epigraphers who noted that the apparent resemblances to ancient writing systems were of the type that can be found between almost any set of simple linear marks and any ancient script, given sufficient selective attention and motivated pattern matching. Without a systematic analysis demonstrating that the Burrows cave inscriptions encode actual language, that they have grammatical structure, consistent symbol frequencies, and the statistical properties of a real writing system, the comparisons are suggestive at best and misleading at worst. Burrows himself became an increasingly complicated figure as the story developed. He sold artifacts. He gave conflicting accounts of aspects of his discovery. He engaged in bitter disputes with researchers who supported him, accusing some of substituting fake objects for real ones, or of misrepresenting his finds. The community of believers around Burrows Cave fractured repeatedly under the pressure of these disputes, with accusations of fraud moving in multiple directions simultaneously. None of this proves that Burrows invented the cave entirely. Absence of verification is not proof of fabrication, and the sociology of a controversial claim, the personality conflicts, the accusations, the fracturing of the believing community, does not tell us anything directly about the physical reality of the artifacts. But it does tell us something about the conditions under which the claim has existed and been evaluated. Conditions that have made honest, rigorous inquiry almost impossible. The secrecy around the cave's location, justified by Burrows on grounds of protecting the site from looters, has the practical effect of making independent verification permanently unavailable. A claim that cannot be independently verified is not, in the scientific sense, a claim that can be evaluated, only believed or disbelieved on the basis of trust. And trust, in the Burrows Cave story, has been in short supply on all sides. What remains beneath the layers of claim and counterclaim and personality and dispute is a set of objects. Some of them genuinely unusual, some of them clearly not what they are claimed to be, and some of them sitting in an ambiguous space that honest analysis has not been able to fully resolve, and a cave somewhere in southern Illinois that may or may not exist. If it exists, if there is genuinely a stone chamber in those bluffs with whatever it contains, then it represents either one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in North American history, or one of the most elaborately sustained hoaxes. The gap between those two possibilities is not narrow. It is absolute. What is perhaps most telling about the Burrows Cave story is the hunger it feeds. The desire, widespread, genuine, deeply human, for evidence that the ancient world was more connected, more adventurous, more surprising than the textbooks suggest. That someone sailed from the shores of the ancient Mediterranean and kept going, past the edge of the known world, until they reached the interior of a continent that the maps of their civilization did not contain. That they lived there and died there and left something behind. It is a beautiful story. It may even in some form be true, not necessarily as Burrows tells it, but as a broader possibility, A reminder that ancient maritime capability was greater than is often acknowledged, and that the Atlantic was not an absolute barrier to human movement. But the Burrows cave artifacts as they currently stand, unprovenanced, contested, inaccessible in their claimed source, cannot carry the weight of that story. They bend under it. The cave, if it is real, is still out there. Somewhere in the Illinois bluffs, in a landscape of oak and hickory and limestone outcroppings, a chamber may be waiting, containing something or nothing, or something entirely different from what has been claimed. What would you find if you could find it? And why, after more than 40 years, has no one been allowed to look? The Burrows Cave story is, at its heart, a story about inaccessibility. A claim that cannot be verified because the evidence cannot be reached. A mystery that sustains itself precisely through its own unavailability. The cave that may or may not exist, the artifacts that may or may not be where they are said to have come from, the location that has never been disclosed and may never be. There is a particular kind of frustration that comes with this type of mystery. Not the productive frustration of a puzzle that is difficult but solvable, but the closed frustration of a door that may have nothing behind it, or everything, and that no one is being allowed to open. The next collection we are moving toward shares some of that same structural quality. A body of objects whose authenticity has been vigorously debated, whose provenance is complicated, and whose implications, if taken at face value, would be among the most extraordinary in the history of human knowledge. But there are important differences. The Ica stones are not hidden. They are abundant. They are physically accessible. Thousands of them exist in collections around the world, and the region that produced them is not a secret location in rural Illinois, but a documented, visited, studied area of the Peruvian desert. And yet, for all that accessibility, the questions surrounding them have not resolved. If anything, they have deepened. The city of Ica sits in a desert valley on the southern coast of Peru, in one of the driest environments on Earth. The Atacama-adjacent coastal desert of this region is so desiccated that organic materials, textiles, wooden objects, human remains, can survive here for thousands of years with minimal deterioration. It is a landscape that preserves things, that holds on to what is placed within it with extraordinary fidelity across enormous spans of time. It is also a landscape with a deep and continuous human history. The Paracas culture flourished here from approximately 800 BC. The Nazca culture followed, producing the famous geoglyphs that cover the nearby Pampa. The region has been inhabited, farmed, and culturally active for millennia, and the desert surrounding the modern city is rich with archaeological sites of varying ages and degrees of documentation. The Ica stones entered public awareness gradually, accumulating over the 20th century in a way that mirrors, in some respects, the Acambaro Figures story. A local source, a passionate collector, a growing body of objects making increasingly extraordinary claims. The central figure in the Ica stone story is Dr. Javier Cabrera Darquea, a physician and amateur archaeologist who began collecting the stones in the 1960s and eventually assembled a museum in Ica containing thousands of examples. The stones themselves are andesite cobbles, smooth, dark river stones found in the dry riverbeds and desert terrain surrounding Ica, on whose surfaces images have been engraved. The engraving technique involves removing the oxidized outer surface of the stone to expose the lighter rock beneath, creating images that, once the stone has re-oxidized around the engraved lines, can appear convincingly aged. The images cover an extraordinary range of subjects: animals, plants, human figures, ritual scenes, what appear to be medical procedures, astronomical observations, and, most controversially, interactions between human beings and creatures that appear to be dinosaurs. Here, as with the Acambaro figures, is the claim that has attracted the most attention and generated the most debate. Stones purportedly from the ancient Peruvian desert depicting human beings hunting, observing, or coexisting with large reptilian creatures whose anatomical profiles resemble theropod dinosaurs, long-necked sauropods, and other genera from the Mesozoic era, Some stones appear to show what might be interpreted as open-heart surgery, telescope-like instruments, or maps of continents in configurations that have been compared to pre-drift arrangements of the Earth's land masses. If genuine, if these engravings were made by a pre-Columbian culture whose members had actual knowledge of dinosaurs, of advanced medicine, of astronomical instruments, and of continental geography, the implications would be simply world-altering. They would require not merely a revision of pre-Columbian history, but a fundamental reconstruction of human prehistory going back tens of millions of years. The archaeological and scientific community has not accepted the Ica stones as genuine ancient artifacts, and the reasons for this skepticism are, in several respects, well-founded. The provenance problem is severe. The vast majority of Ica stones entered collections through purchase from local huaqueros, grave robbers and artifact sellers, without any controlled excavation or stratigraphic documentation. The supply has been essentially unlimited, growing in direct proportion to collector demand, which is itself a pattern more consistent with ongoing production than with a finite ancient source. When researchers have attempted to verify the claimed source locations, specific dry riverbeds and desert sites near Ica, they have not found convincing in situ deposits of engraved stones in contexts that would confirm ancient origin. Most damagingly, local artisans in the Ica region have openly acknowledged producing engraved stones for sale to tourists and collectors. When shown examples from the Cabrera collection and asked if they or their families had made similar objects, some confirmed that they had. The technique of engraving andesite cobbles and allowing the surface to reoxidize, producing the appearance of age, is not complex, and the time required to produce an individual stone is not prohibitive. This is, for most researchers, the end of the story. The Ica stones are modern craft objects, produced to meet collector demand, with imagery drawn partly from popular depictions of dinosaurs and ancient astronaut literature. The case is considered closed, but, and this is where the honest investigator is required to pause, the case for complete modern fabrication of the entire corpus is not quite as airtight as its confident assertion suggests. The Ica stone tradition did not begin with Cabrera. Spanish colonial accounts from the 16th century describe engraved stones being found in the Ica region, predating the modern collector market by 4 centuries. Father Cobo, a Jesuit priest writing in the early 17th century, described small engraved stones from the Ica area that he considered curious enough to mention. These accounts, if taken seriously, push the history of at least some engraved stones in the region back to a period before the tourist trade and the collector market existed. Archaeological excavations at Paracas and related coastal sites have occasionally produced small engraved stones in controlled contexts. The number is very small, and none of the confirmed archaeological examples display the dramatic imagery, the dinosaurs, the surgical scenes, the astronomical instruments, that characterizes the Cabrera collection. But their existence demonstrates that the tradition of engraving stones in this region is not purely a modern commercial invention. The question this raises is whether the modern production, which is clearly real and clearly accounts for a substantial portion of the stones in circulation, entirely explains the phenomenon, or whether it grew from and eventually overwhelmed a smaller, genuinely ancient tradition of engraved stones, absorbing its forms and vastly amplifying its imagery to meet collector demand. If the latter is true, if there is a genuine ancient substrate beneath the modern commercial production, then the critical question becomes which stones, if any, belong to that substrate. And that question cannot be answered without the kind of controlled, systematic study that the stone's complicated provenance and the sensitivity of the subject have made difficult to conduct. The dinosaur imagery specifically requires a careful handling that it rarely receives in either direction. The enthusiast position that the imagery proves human-dinosaur coexistence is not supportable by the available evidence, and the scientific consensus on the extinction timeline of non-avian dinosaurs is not a matter of serious dispute. Whatever the Ica stones show, they do not show what they are claimed to show by their most ardent defenders. But the skeptic position, that the imagery is simply copied from modern paleontological illustrations by local craftsmen aware of what collectors wanted, also requires examination. Some of the animal forms on Ica stones that have been compared to dinosaurs bear a closer resemblance to the specific anatomical reconstructions current at the time the collector market was developing than to genuinely ancient artistic conventions. This is consistent with modern production. It does not by itself rule out the possibility that some forms in the corpus have older origins that modern craftsmen were imitating or elaborating upon. What the Ica stones ultimately represent, in the broadest sense, setting aside the question of authenticity, is a region with a genuine ancient tradition of engraved stone objects that has been so thoroughly overwhelmed by modern production and so thoroughly colonized by extraordinary claims that the underlying reality has become genuinely difficult to access. Somewhere in the dry riverbeds near Ica, in the desert soil that has preserved Paracas textiles and Nazca wooden posts for 2,000 years, there may be engraved stones in undisturbed ancient contexts. Stones that no one has yet excavated properly, whose imagery no one has yet catalogued with scientific rigor, and whose age has not yet been determined by reliable methods. What do those stones show? Not the stones in Cabrera's museum, not the ones sold in the market, the ones still in the ground, waiting in the desert that preserves everything. Are they there? And if someone found them, really found them in context, datable and unambiguous, what would they say? The Ica stones remind us that the desert preserves, that in the right conditions, extreme aridity, stable temperature, the absence of the biological processes that break down organic material in wetter environments, things that should have disappeared thousands of years ago remain. Textiles with their colors intact, wooden objects still holding their shape, human remains so well preserved that the expression on a face carved 2 millennia ago can still be read in its features. The desert is, in this sense, a kind of archive, imperfect, selective, subject to the distortions introduced by looters and collectors and the commercial pressures that have compromised so many sites across the ancient world. But an archive nonetheless, a place where the past is held in a form that can, if approached carefully and honestly, still tell us something true. And the ocean is an archive too, a very different kind. Dynamic where the desert is static, destructive where the desert preserves, constantly moving and reshaping and redistributing what is placed within it. And yet the coastlines where ocean meets land, where tidal and estuarine environments create their own specific conditions of burial and preservation, have yielded some of the most remarkable and least expected discoveries in the entire history of human remains. What we are moving toward now is a discovery that emerged not from the deep desert, but from the margins of water and land, from the sediments of a coastal lagoon in Western Australia that gave up something unexpected, something that has generated genuine scientific debate, and something that touches on questions about the deep human history of an entire continent. Hutt Lagoon lies on the coast of Western Australia, north of the town of Geraldton, in the Midwest region of the state. It is perhaps best known today for its striking pink color, the result of high salinity and the presence of a carotenoid-producing algae, Dunaliella salina, that turns the water a vivid rose pink that appears almost artificial in photographs. It is a place of considerable natural beauty, shallow and hypersaline, separated from the Indian Ocean by a narrow coastal barrier. But beneath the sediments of this striking landscape, in the kind of context that speaks to a very different version of this coastline across the deep past, human remains were discovered that placed the site in a very different kind of conversation. The Hutt Lagoon skeletal remains, sometimes referred to in the academic literature as the Hutt Lagoon individual, represent one of the oldest human skeletal finds in Australia, and among the oldest well-documented human remains discovered anywhere in the southern hemisphere. The initial discovery and subsequent analysis produced an estimated age that, depending on the dating method applied and the specific material dated, falls somewhere in the range of approximately 6,000 to 10,000 years before the present, with some analyses suggesting the upper end of that range and others producing more conservative estimates. In the context of Australian prehistory, even the more conservative dating is significant. 10,000 years ago, the coastline of Western Australia looked fundamentally different from what it does today. The end of the last ice age had only recently, in geological terms, raised global sea levels substantially, inundating vast areas of the continental shelf that had previously been dry land. The landscape that the Hutt Lagoon individual inhabited, lived within, and was ultimately buried in, was not the coastline as it exists now. It was a different world. A world in which the Australian landmass extended considerably further to the west and northwest, in which the ecological conditions of the Midwest coast were shaped by a climate still transitioning out of the Ice Age, and in which the human communities of this region were navigating environmental changes of a scale and speed that are difficult to fully appreciate from our current vantage point. The physical characteristics of the Hutt Lagoon individual have been the subject of careful osteological analysis. What the remains represent in terms of their completeness, their preservation state, and the information they carry about the person whose bones they were, is a window, partial and fragmentary, as such windows always are, into the physical reality of human life in this part of Australia at a period that predates any written record by an enormous margin. The broader significance of the Hutt Lagoon individual sits within one of the most actively debated areas of Australian and world prehistory: the question of human morphological diversity in ancient Australia, and what that diversity tells us about the deep history of human migration, population structure, and biological variation on the continent. Australia presents a genuinely complex picture to physical anthropologists and geneticists studying ancient human remains. The oldest human skeletal material from the continent, including the famous Mungo Man and Mungo Lady from New South Wales, dated to approximately 40,000 years ago, displays a range of physical characteristics that has generated substantial discussion about whether early Australian populations were more morphologically diverse than later populations, and what that diversity implies about patterns of migration and genetic exchange across the deep past. The Hutt Lagoon individual, while considerably more recent than the Mungo material, adds to this picture in ways that researchers have found meaningful, contributing to the accumulating body of evidence about who was living on the Australian coast in the period following the last ice age, how they were related to earlier and later populations, and what the physical record of their remains can tell us about their lives, their health, and the conditions they faced. What is harder to recover, and what the bones, however carefully analyzed, cannot by themselves provide, is the cultural context, the beliefs, the social structures, the relationships with landscape and with each other that shape the lives of the people who buried this individual, who presumably mourned them, who placed them in the ground with whatever rituals and intentions their tradition prescribed. This is where the Hutt Lagoon skeleton connects to the broader themes running through this entire exploration. The physical evidence, the bones, the sediments, the dating, tells us that a human being lived and died here, in this coastal environment, at a time when the world looked different and the story of human habitation on this continent was still being written in ways we are only beginning to understand. What it cannot tell us, directly, is anything about the knowledge that person carried, the stories they knew, the relationships they held with the landscape around them, the lagoon, the coast, the sea, the interior, the astronomical knowledge, the ecological understanding, the cultural memory that was, for communities of this depth of habitation in Australia, already ancient by the time this individual was born. The Aboriginal Australian traditions that have maintained continuous cultural connection to this part of Western Australia carry within them a depth of environmental and historical knowledge that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. Oral traditions from various Australian communities have been shown, in recent decades, to encode memories of genuine geological events: sea level changes, volcanic eruptions, landscape transformations that occurred thousands of years ago. The accuracy of these traditions, tested against independent geological evidence, has been striking. Whether any living tradition carries a memory that connects, even distantly, to the communities that buried the Hutt Lagoon individual, to the people who lived on this coastline 10,000 years ago when the sea was rising and the landscape was changing around them, is a question that sits at the intersection of archaeological science and living cultural knowledge in a way that no laboratory analysis can resolve alone. The pink lagoon holds its color in the afternoon light. Tourists photograph it from the road. The water is shallow enough, in places, to see the bottom. And in the sediments beneath the surface, not necessarily at Hutt Lagoon specifically, but along this coastline, in the drowned landscapes of the continental shelf, in the burial sites and campsites and middens of a coastal culture that lived here across 10,000 years of continuous habitation, there is almost certainly more. More individuals, more material, more physical evidence of lives lived at a time and in a way that we have barely begun to understand. Most of it is underwater now. The rising seas of the post-glacial period inundated the outer continental shelf, the land where coastal communities would have concentrated their activities, following the water's edge as it moved, and covered it with tens of meters of ocean. The archaeological record of those communities, if it survives at all, lies in water too deep and too difficult to excavate with current technology. The bones that make it to the surface, preserved in a lagoon, exposed by erosion, recovered from a site that the sea has not yet fully reclaimed, are fragments, representative of a population, a culture, a period of human history on this continent that is almost entirely beyond our current reach. What was life like on the coast of Western Australia 10,000 years ago? Who were the people who watched the sea rise, year by year, generation by generation, slowly covering the land their ancestors had walked? And what did they do with that knowledge? Where did they carry it? And how much of it is still being held, in traditions older than any written record, by the communities whose country this has always been?